He opened his eyes and saw a foreign sky, orange, heavy, smelling of smoke and manure. His back burned as if a red-hot poker had been run across it. The taste of blood lingered in his mouth. Park Do Hwan tried to sit up, but immediately fell back onto the straw. His body wouldn't obey him. It felt foreign, thin, bony. His hands were scraped raw. His ribs jutted out beneath his skin. He raised his palms to his face and didn't recognize them. His fingers were long. The calluses were in the wrong places. Not his hands, not his body. An old cow was breathing heavily nearby, brown, bony, with cracked horns and cloudy eyes. She was lying on her side right in the mud. Her ribs jutted out beneath her thin hide. Do Hwan looked at her and for a second forgot his own pain. He'd seen cows like this hundreds of times. Dehydration, exhaustion, possibly an infection, possibly worse. He tried to stand up again. His knees were shaking, but he stood up. He looked around. Behind him stood the village, small, dirty, surrounded by a crooked stockade. The gate was closed. In front of the gate, a broken stick lay in the dust. That very stick, the one they'd beaten him with. He didn't remember it, but his body did. His back burned from the blows. His lip was split open. His left eye was watering. Someone had beaten this guy up and thrown him out the gate along with the cow, like trash. Hwan stood there for a moment. He looked at the closed gate. He looked at the cow. And he made the only decision he knew how to make. He took off his jacket, his only one, thin, reeking of sweat and blood, and draped it over the cow's back. Then he knelt down beside her and placed his hand on her side. Her heartbeat was faint. Her breathing was irregular. Her temperature was high. There was something hard under her shoulder blade, a lump. He ran his fingers along her ribs. The cow flinched. It hurt. That meant the inflammation was deep. He examined her udder. It was dry. It hadn't been milked in a long time. Her teats were chapped, her hooves were worn down to the flesh. This cow had been driven a long way and hadn't been fed. He stroked her between her horns. Slowly, just as he used to pet the calves on the farm in Chola, the cow turned her head toward him and looked at him with huge, moist eyes. There was something strange in those eyes, something too thoughtful for an animal. But Do Hwan didn't dwell on it. It didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she was dying, and that he was the only one who could stop it. He stood up and looked around. There were hills all around, brown, scorched. Not a single patch of green as far as the eye could see. The earth was cracked from the drought. The trees stood bare. He recognized this scene, the third year without a decent harvest. Maybe the fourth. The land was depleted. Someone had burned down the forests. Someone didn't know about crop rotation, or knew but didn't care. Do Hwan walked down the slope. His legs buckled. This young man's body was weak. Not just thin, but painfully weak. He hadn't been fed properly for a long time, maybe his whole life. But Do Hwan kept walking, because there must be water down below. Where the hills meet, there's always a stream, even during a drought. Even a small one. He found it 20 minutes later, a thin, murky trickle between the rocks, not a spring, just seeping out from under a cliff. But water. He cupped his hands full, tasted it, cool, odorless, clean. He went back to the cow. She hadn't moved an inch. She was lying in the same position. Breathing heavily, he took off one boot, a leather one, full of holes. But it'll do as a dipper. He scooped up some water and brought it over. He held it up to the cow's muzzle. She didn't drink. Her nostrils didn't even twitch. That's bad. When an animal refuses water, it means the pain is stronger than the thirst. He set the boot down nearby. He needed a fire. He needed to warm the water. He needed to find at least some kind of herb for a decoction. He searched the surroundings. He found some dry brush. He found a bunch of bitter wormwood. He found some kind of root that looked like burdock. Not ideal, but it'll do for a first attempt. The wormwood will reduce the inflammation. The root will provide at least some nourishment. He didn't have a flint, but he had 2 stones, flint and something resembling obsidian. He struck sparks for 20 minutes. His hands were shaking. His fingers wouldn't obey him, but he struck the sparks. The dry grass caught fire. He fanned the flames. He tossed in some twigs. The flames rose. Do Hwan heated the water in the same shoe. He crumbled the wormwood. He tossed in the root. The result was a murky, bitter slurry. Not medicine, but better than nothing. He brought the warm brew to the cow's muzzle. She opened her eyes slightly. He began to speak, quietly, calmly, in the same voice he used when talking to calves. There, old girl, drink a little. Just a tiny bit, you'll feel better. I promise. The cow blinked and began to drink, slowly, sip by sip. Do Hwan held the bucket and didn't move. She drank it all. Then she let her head fall onto the straw and closed her eyes. Her breathing became a little more even. Just a little. But he noticed. He always noticed. Something strange suddenly popped into his head, as if someone had quietly spoken the words directly into his mind. Shepherd system activated. Connection not established. Trust level 0. He froze. He looked around. No one was there. The voice didn't speak again. Do Hwan rubbed his temples. Maybe the blow to his head had been too hard. Maybe he was hallucinating from hunger. He didn't dwell on it. Now wasn't the time for that. Right now, he needed to build a shelter. Night was falling, and the cow wouldn't survive the cold in her current condition. He worked until dark. He found a shallow hollow in the hillside, not a cave, just a recess in the rock. But the wind didn't blow in there. He gathered dry grass. He lined the floor with it. He built a wall out of branches and stones. He couldn't drag the cow in. She was 4 times heavier than he was, but he coaxed her to stand up. Again in that same voice. Come on, Nuna, 10 steps, just 10. Then you'll lie down and sleep. I won't go anywhere. The cow stood up. She took 15 steps. She collapsed into the shelter. Do Hwan covered her with grass. He tossed some firewood onto the bonfire at the entrance. He sat down nearby. He leaned his back against a rock. He closed his eyes, and only then did he allow himself to think. Where was he? What had happened? Why wasn't this his body? Why was the sky orange? Why was there a broken stick lying outside the village gates? He didn't find any answers, but he found something else. Peace, because lying nearby was a sick cow that needed help. And he knew how to help cows. It was the only thing he knew how to do well. And as long as it worked, he would keep doing it. No matter what world he was in, no matter what body he was in the morning he'll work on the lump under his shoulder blade. Right now, he needs to sleep. At least a couple of hours. He closed his eyes. The cow next to him let out a heavy sigh, and he instinctively placed his hand on her side. Just as he'd done 1,000 times before. Warm, alive, breathing. That means everything will be all right. As long as she's breathing, there's a chance. Morning dawned cold, gray. Fog crept across the hills like milk. Do Hwan woke up to the sound of the cow moaning. Low, drawn out. He sat up and immediately placed his hand on her side. Her temperature was higher than yesterday's. The lump under her shoulder blade had grown. He felt it, hot, pulsing, an abscess. It needs to be lanced. If he doesn't lance it today, blood poisoning will set in, and then no herbal decoction will help. He looked at his hands. Empty. No knife, no needle, no thread. He searched through everything he had on him. He found a scrap of rope, a bone fragment, a sharp stone. No good. He couldn't use the stone. Too rough, too dirty. He needed a knife. He looked toward the village. The gate was still closed, but next to the gate stood a trash shed. He'd seen it yesterday. There was some scrap lying around. Maybe there was something metal among them. Do Hwan headed toward the village. He didn't get too close. If they saw him, they'd beat him up again, or worse. He circled around the gate from the ravine side. He reached the trash pile. He rummaged through it. He found a rusty sickle with a broken handle. The blade was dull, but it's metal. It can be sharpened. It can be tempered over a fire, and he grabbed the sickle and ran back. By the campfire, he sharpened the sickle on a stone for a long time, carefully. Then he heated the blade in the fire until it was red hot. Then he cooled it in the stream. He boiled some water. He dipped the blade into it. Not sterile, but better than nothing. He soaked a scrap of rope and unraveled it into strands. Thin. Rough. But they'd do for stitching. He approached the cow. She was lying on her side. Her eyes were half closed. Her breathing was rapid. She was in pain. He knelt down beside her. He placed his hand on her muzzle. He spoke softly. Nuna, I need to do something. It's going to hurt, but then you'll feel better. I promise. Bear with me. I'll be quick. The cow opened her eyes. She looked at him and rested her head on his lap. He swallowed hard. He took the sickle he felt for the center of the abscess and cut it open. The cow flinched. She moaned, but she didn't kick. She didn't stand up. She stayed lying down. She trusted him. Pus gushed from the wound, thick, dark, mixed with blood, a lot, too much for a normal abscess. Do Hwan washed the wound with warm wormwood decoction. He cleaned it. He squeezed it. Then he washed it again. Deep inside the wound, he saw something strange, something dark. It looked like a seared pattern right on the bone, a brand. Someone had seared some kind of symbol onto this cow's bone. Do Hwan didn't understand what it was, but he realized it was hot, hotter than the surrounding tissue, as if it were burning from the inside. He couldn't remove it. He couldn't cut it out, but he could clean out everything around it, remove the pus, remove the dead tissue, and give the body a chance to isolate the brand on its own. He worked for half an hour. His hands were covered in blood up to his elbows. The cow moaned but didn't move. When he finished, he stitched up the wound with strands of rope. Roughly, but tightly. The edges came together. He applied a bandage made from his shirt, his only one. Now he was naked from the waist up in the cold wind, but the cow had stopped moaning. Her breathing had slowed. It had become deeper, more even. He boiled up a concoction from the root. He added a pinch of salt he'd found in his jacket pocket. Apparently, the previous owner of this body had carried salt with him. A herdsman. Herdsmen always carry salt. Do Hwan smiled. At least that much made sense. He fed the broth to the cow from his cupped hands. She drank greedily. A good sign. A very good one. He spent the whole day by her side. He changed the bandage. He heated water. He looked for edible roots. He found a few. He cooked up a thin soup for himself and for her. Half for her, half for himself. By evening, the cow raised her head. She looked at him. Her eyes grew clearer, more meaningful. There was something in them he couldn't describe. Gratitude? No. More than that. Recognition, as if she knew him, had always known him. He chalked it up to exhaustion, to hunger, to the blow to the head. He covered her with the remaining grass, tossed some firewood on the fire, sat down beside her, and at that moment, that voice sounded in his head again. Connection with creature number 1. Trust level, 4%, ability unlocked. Diagnosis through touch. Do Hwan froze. 4%. So she had started to trust him. 4%. That was enough to turn what he was already capable of into something greater. He placed his palm on her side, and he saw. Not with his eyes, with something else. A picture. A complete picture of her condition. Every organ, every muscle, every bone. Severe exhaustion, chronic joint inflammation, old fractures. 3 ribs had been broken and had healed crookedly. The brand on her shoulder blade burned as a dark spot. Around it, the tissue was slowly dying for years. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone wanted her to die a long, slow, agonizing death until Hwan pulled his hand away. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from rage. He clenched his fists, he looked at the cow, he looked at the brand, and he said quietly, "I don't know who did this to you, but I'll get you out of here. Do you hear me? I'll get you out of this." The night was cold. He didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, feeding it one twig at a time. The cow was breathing evenly. She was sleeping, for the first time in a long time. He could feel it, not through diagnosis. He just felt it. By dawn, her temperature had dropped, almost back to normal. The abscess was no longer throbbing. The brand was still burning, but less intensely. Her body had begun to fight back. He'd helped it get started. Now it would take time and food. In the morning, he went out again to look for roots. He found wild onions. He found something that looked like a turnip. He found a stream with small fish. He caught 3 of them with his bare hands. He cooked everything in his boot, half for her, half for himself. She ate well. When he turned toward the fire to toss on some wood, the cow stood up behind him. He heard a strange sound, not a moo, a crackling sound, as if bones were breaking, as if skin were tearing. He turned around and froze. The cow was standing on its hind legs, stretching, growing. Its hide was cracking and flaking off like old bark. Beneath it was skin, dark, smooth, human. The horns stretched upward. They turned black, sharp, beautiful. The muzzle narrowed. It became a face, broad cheekbones, heavy eyebrows, eyes enormous, golden, full of tears. Standing before him was a woman, 2 meters tall, broad-shouldered, with black horns, in the tatters of what had once been a cloak. The bandage he'd made from his shirt was still on her left shoulder, stained with blood and pus. She stood there and wept. Silently, tears streamed down her face, down her neck, down her collarbones. She looked down at him, and he saw in her eyes the same thing he'd seen in the cow's eyes. Recognition. But now he couldn't chalk it up to fatigue. She opened her mouth. Her voice was hoarse, low, as if she hadn't spoken in a very long time. She said that for 300 years no one had asked her where it hurt. Do Hwan stood barefoot. Mora stood by the fire, trembling, not from the cold, from weakness. The transformation had drained her of her last reserves of strength. Do Hwan could see this without any diagnosis. Her knees were buckling, her shoulders were slumped, her breathing was ragged. She had been enormous, powerful, and utterly helpless. He walked over to her. He picked up the jacket from the ground, the very one he'd used to cover her when she was a cow, and draped it over her shoulders. The jacket was too small, ridiculous, like a scarf on a statue, but Mavra clutched it with both hands and wrapped herself in it. He told her she needed to sit down, that she couldn't stand, that she needed to eat. She looked down at him with an expression he would later learn to recognize, a mixture of distrust and hope, and she sat down, heavily. The ground shook. Do Hwan warmed up the leftover stew. He served it to her in a folded piece of bark. She took it, sniffed it, and began to eat greedily, quickly, like a beast that couldn't remember the last time it had eaten. He didn't watch. He turned away. He let her eat without witnesses, because he knew a proud creature feels ashamed when seen hungry. When she finished, he asked, not who she was, not what had happened, not why she was a cow. He asked how long it had been since she'd slept properly. Mavra froze. Then she replied that she didn't remember, maybe 100 years, maybe more. Hwan nodded. He said she would lie down now, that he would stay by her side, that they would talk in the morning. She wanted to object. He saw her take a deep breath, how the muscles in her jaw tensed. She was used to giving orders, used to making decisions, used to being strong. But her body decided for her. Her eyes closed. She fell onto her side right where she'd been sitting. He gathered some dry grass. He piled it around her on all sides. He tossed some firewood onto the campfire and sat down beside her. Again, he placed his palm on her forehead. The diagnostic system activated on its own. Her condition was serious, but stable. The brand on her shoulder blade continued to smolder, slowly destroying the surrounding tissue. But slowly. He had time. Not much, but he had some. The system's voice sounded again. Trust level, 6%. Do Hwan withdrew his hand. 6%. 2% in a single night, because he hadn't asked any questions, because he turned away while she was eating. In the morning, Mavra spoke. On her own, he hadn't asked her to. She just started talking, as if a dam had burst. She spoke quietly, in a hoarse voice, without looking at him, staring into the fire. She told him she had been the queen of the Minotaurs, the last of the Iron Horns. She told him about the Great Purge, about how 300 years ago the Church of the One Sun had slaughtered the men and driven the women into mountain reservations, about taxes, about prohibitions, about how her people were slowly dying out because without husbands no children were being born, about how the elder matriarchs died one after another, about how the tribes began fighting among themselves over the last scraps, about how she tried to negotiate with the humans, the last of all who tried, and about how she was betrayed. Not the humans, her own people, her own council. They decided that a treaty with the humans was a sign of weakness, that it was better to die with pride than to beg the enemy for bread. They summoned the Inquisitor. He imposed the brand, not by his own hand, but through an intermediary, someone Mavra never saw. The brand turned her into a cow, brainless, voiceless. She spent 300 days in that form, 300 days in the body of an animal, with the mind of a queen. For 300 days she understood everything. She felt everything. She remembered everything, and she couldn't utter a single word. Do Hwan listened? He didn't interrupt. He didn't say, uh-huh. He didn't say he was sorry. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said she needed to change the bandage on her shoulder. Mavra looked at him for a long time and held out her hand. He unwound the old bandage, examined the suture. Clean. The edges were pulling together. The inflammation was gone. He applied a new bandage made from a torn piece of. Now his pants ended above his knee. He looked ridiculous, small, skinny, half-naked, standing next to a 2-meter-tall queen. She said he was a strange man. He replied that he wasn't strange, just a shepherd. They set off southward. Mora said there was a valley in the southern mountains, the last place where the beast girls still lived. The journey would take 3 or 4 days. She could have made it in a day. Back then. Now she stopped every hour, sat down on a rock, and caught her breath. Do Hwan didn't rush her. He walked beside her. When she stopped, he scanned the surroundings. He looked for water. He looked for food. He looked for anything that might be useful. He found an abandoned vegetable garden near a burned-down hut. He dug up a few small turnips. He found a wild pear tree, a small one, sour. He split everything in half. She got the bigger half. He took the smaller one. She noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. During a rest stop, he built a fire and brewed a decoction from bark for her joints. Mavra said her joints didn't hurt, until Hwan replied that both her knees and her right hip were aching. She could say whatever she wanted, but the way she walked told a different story. Mavra fell silent. She drank the decoction. It was bitter, but she drank it all. Trust, 9%. By evening, on the first day of their journey, they stumbled upon 3 people, 3 figures by an extinguished campfire at the edge of a ravine. Do Hwan saw them first. He gestured for Mavra to stop. He looked closer. 3 girls, young, thin, dirty. One had red ears sticking out of her hair. The second had a thin, fluffy tail. The third had small, curled horns, and something resembling wings on her back. Very small ones, like a baby bird's. They sat around the dead fire and didn't move. They weren't sleeping. They were just sitting there, with empty eyes. Du Hwan looked at Mavra. She nodded, one of us. Refugees. He walked toward them, slowly, hands in plain sight. The one with the red ears reacted first. She jumped up, bared her teeth. Her eyes were yellow, like a wolf's. She was ready to fight, ready to kill. Du Hwan stopped. He didn't back away. He didn't raise his hands in defense. He simply stopped and spoke in that voice. Quiet. Steady. He said he wasn't dangerous, that he had fire and water, that if they were hungry, he could cook up some soup. The red-eared one didn't move. The tailed one behind her raised her head. She sniffed the air. The horned one with wings didn't even stir. She just stared at the ground. Then from behind Du Hwan, Mavra stepped forward. Full height, black horns, golden eyes. The red-eared one took a step back. Her eyes widened. She recognized him. She whispered a single word. Mavra nodded. Yes, it's me. The red-eared one dropped to her knees. The tailed one began to cry. The horned one with wings raised her head for the first time. Du Hwan didn't wait. He built a fire. He boiled water. He cooked a thin soup from turnips and the last remaining roots. Enough for 5. Watery, but hot. He handed it out, a piece of bark to each of them. He ate last. He got almost nothing for himself, but he didn't show it. While they ate, he examined them. The red-eared one, a she-wolf. Young, strong by nature, but emaciated, scraped knuckles, fresh scars on her paws. She'd been fighting, recently, and more than once. The one with the tail. A fox, slender, beautiful even now. Dirty, intelligent eyes, alert, watching his every move. The one with horns and wings, the youngest. Maybe 16, maybe 17. Small, quiet. Her wings pressed against her back. Her horns are broken off. Not by herself. Someone broke them off, on purpose. Until Hwan saw it, and his hands clenched into fists. He turned away, pretended to tend the fire. That night, Mavra told him briefly, the red-eared one is named Yuna. The one with the tail is Soa, and the horned one with wings is Hana. Yuna lost her younger sister to the Inquisitors a month ago. She hasn't slept since. She roams the mountains looking for a fight. Soba ran away from the city of humans. Mora didn't say what she was doing there. She just clenched her jaw, so it couldn't have been anything good. Hana. Mora spoke of her very quietly. Hana's own people called her tainted. Her wings were too small. Her horns were too fragile. They cast her out of the tribe. They broke off her horns as a parting gift so she'd remember. Do Hwan listened. He said nothing. He stared into the fire. Then he stood up. He walked over to Hana. She was asleep or pretending to be. He crouched down beside her. He carefully examined the fragments of her horns. His diagnosis was clear. They had been broken off roughly. Her nerves were damaged. The pain was constant. Every day, every hour, she'd simply gotten used to it. Do Hwan clenched his teeth. He found some soft grass. He soaked it. He wrapped it around the broken pieces. Something like a compress. Not a cure, but it would ease the pain. Hana opened her eyes. She looked at him. He smiled. He said it would feel better by morning. She didn't say anything, but when he walked away, he saw that she was holding the compress with both hands, pressing it against her horns, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Yuna hadn't been sleeping. She was sitting on a rock, staring into the darkness. Then Hwan sat down beside her, not too close, just an arm's length away. She glanced at him. Her eyes were yellow, angry and wary. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, silent, staring at the stars. Half an hour later, she spoke up on her own. She asked who he was, why he was helping, what he wanted. Her voice was rough, sharp, like a bark. Do Hwan replied that he was a shepherd, that a shepherd takes care of those around him, that he didn't need anything from her. Yuna snorted. She said that all men want something. Do Hwan shrugged. He said he wasn't like all men. He was a shepherd who couldn't even properly treat a cow. He'd had to use a sickle instead of a scalpel. A disgrace to the entire field of veterinary science. Yuna looked at him. She didn't understand half of what he said, but the corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, but close. She said he was strange. He replied that he'd already been told that today. So wasn't asleep either. She was lying there with her eyes closed, but Do Hwan could see her eyelashes fluttering. She was listening to every word. He didn't go over to her. He didn't speak to her. She was the type who needed time, the kind who observes first, then decides, and then acts. He gave her that time. He just checked to make sure her piece of bark with soup was empty. She'd eaten it all right. On the third day of their journey, they saw a valley. It opened up suddenly, beyond the last pass, like a palm between the fingers of the mountains. Green. Even now. Even after 3 years of drought, streams flowed down from the mountain slopes and fed the valley floor. The grass was brown, but alive. The trees stood crooked, but still had leaves. This wasn't the desert they'd just crossed. This was a place where people could live. Do Hwan stopped at the edge of the pass and looked down. His expert eyes were already assessing the situation. There's water. The soil is clayey but suitable. The slopes face south. There's plenty of sun. You can plow, you can sow, you can graze, if you know how. He knew how. But first, they had to go down. And going down wasn't easy, because at the bottom of the valley lived those who weren't expecting guests. Mavra stopped him on the trail. She said that the Council of Matriarchs wouldn't accept them just like that, wouldn't accept him, a human, a man. She might be a queen, but she was in exile. 300 days. Much had changed in that time. Do Hwan nodded. He asked how many were down there. Mavra thought for a moment. When she left, there had been about 80. Now there might be fewer. Disease, hunger, skirmishes. Do Hwan nodded again. 80 or fewer, the hungry, sick, divided, without men, without trade, without proper food, without hope. He clenched his jaw and headed down. They were met at the entrance to the valley. 6 figures blocked the path, large, armed, 2 minotaurs with spears, 3 she-wolves with knives, and 1 tigress, huge. A scar across her eye, she stood at the front of the group and looked at them as if they were dust. Do Hwan stopped. Mora stepped forward. She spoke the tigress's name, Ryan. The tigress didn't move. Then she slowly said that the dead do not return. Mora said she wasn't dead. Ryan looked at Do Hwan, then at the three girls behind him, then back at Mora. She asked why she'd brought a human. Mora replied that he'd saved her life. Ryung snorted. She said that humans don't save. Humans use, and then they burn. She turned and walked deeper into the valley. The guards parted, but they didn't lower their weapons. They passed through. The valley was worse than Do Hwan had imagined, much worse. He walked along the central path and counted. The huts were falling apart. The roofs were full of holes. The walls were rotten. Bonfires smoldered with damp firewood. Children sat on the ground, skinny, quiet, not playing. The adults stared with empty eyes. There was a line at the well in the center of the settlement. Long, slow, Do Hwan approached the well. He peered inside. The water was murky. It smelled bad. He scooped some up, sniffed it, tasted it with the tip of his tongue, spit it out. Contaminated. Bacteria. Maybe E. coli. Maybe something worse. He looked at the line, at the children with bloated bellies. He realized where the illnesses were coming from. That's where. They drink this every day. The council of matriarchs gathered that evening. 5 elders, 3 minotaurs, 1 she-wolf, 1 vixen, all old, all stern. They all looked at Do Hwan as if he were an insect. Mora introduced him. She said he was a shepherd and a healer, that he had cured her of the curse. The eldest of the minotaurs asked what he wanted. Do Hwan replied that he wanted to repair the well. Silence. Then the matriarch fox laughed, a dry, malicious laugh. She said that a human had come to repair the well. How generous. The matriarch she-wolf asked what price he would charge. Do Hwan said he wasn't asking for a price. He was asking for a shovel if they had one. The council exchanged glances. Ryong stood by the wall, silently, with her arms crossed. She stared at him without blinking. The elder Minotaur said they would think it over. Do Hwan replied that they needed to decide quickly. The children were getting sick from this water. Every day of waiting meant one more sick child. The silence grew heavy. Ryong, in the corner, tilted her head slightly. For the first time all evening, she looked at him not with contempt, but with something else, with interest. They didn't give him a shovel. They gave him a stick and told him to figure it out. Du Hwan took the stick. He went to the well. He started digging at dawn, alone. He worked all day. Yuna came an hour later. She sat down silently beside him. Then she stood up. She picked up a rock. She began chipping away at the ground next to him. She didn't say a word. She just worked. Around noon, Hana arrived. She brought water from the stream, clean mountain water. Do Hwan drank some and continued digging. By evening, Soa arrived. She didn't dig. She stood and watched. Then she left. An hour later, she returned, with a shovel, a real one, made of iron. Do Hwan didn't ask where she'd gotten it. Soa smiled and shrugged. She said she'd found it. He didn't believe her, but he took the shovel. In 3 days, he reached the aquifer. Clean. Adip. The problem wasn't the well itself. The problem was the drainage. Sewage from the huts flowed straight into the well, contaminating it. No one had noticed, or perhaps they had, but didn't know what to do. Do Hwan dug a drainage ditch, a long one, from the huts toward the ravine. A simple thing, straight out of a first-year sanitation textbook. 3 days of work, a shovel, a stick, his hands. When he opened the new drain and the first clear water rose in the well, 30 animal girls stood around it, silently. One of them scooped up some water, drank it, looked at her friend, nodded. Clean. Du Hwan sat on the ground. Dirty. Wet. His hands scraped raw. He didn't celebrate. He thought about what came next. The well was the beginning, just the beginning. On the 5th day after arriving in the valley, a scream woke him. In the middle of the night. Sharp, animalistic, he jumped up. He ran out of the hut they'd assigned him. Small, with a hole in the roof. A crowd had gathered around the fire in the center of the settlement. He pushed his way through. A she-wolf lay on the ground. Young, pregnant. Her belly was enormous. She was screaming and clutching the ground with her paws. 2 older she-wolves stood nearby. Their faces were filled with fear. Do Hwan dropped to his knees. He placed his hand on her belly. Diagnosis: 2 pups, One in the correct position, the other transverse. Transverse presentation. Without intervention, the mother would die, and both pups as well. He looked at the older she-wolves. He asked who here was the midwife. One of them raised her hand. Do Hwan asked what she was going to do. She replied that she was going to pray. Do Hwan clenched his teeth. He said that prayer would have to wait. Right now, he needed hot water, a clean cloth, a rope, and light, lots of light. The midwife blinked. Then she ran off. 5 minutes later, he had everything he needed. He worked for 2 hours. He spoke to the she-wolf in that voice, quiet and steady. She grabbed his hand and squeezed so hard his fingers cracked. He didn't flinch. He didn't wince. He kept talking. The first puppy came out on its own, small, red, wet. It yelped right away. Strong lungs. Do Hwan handed it to the midwife. He set to work on the second one, transverse presentation. It needed to be turned by hand, carefully, very carefully. One wrong move and the uterus would rupture. He closed his eyes. His hands moved on their own. Muscle memory, the memory of a livestock technician. He'd done this dozens of times. With cows, with goats, with sheep. The anatomy was different here, but the principle was the same. Carefully, slowly, a turn. The puppy turned. It came out. It didn't cry out. It wasn't breathing. Do Hwan picked it up. Tiny, gray, wet, lifeless. He cleared its mouth, its nose, rubbed its chest, leaned down, blowed on it. Again, once more, the pup twitched, coughed. It yelped. Do Hwan closed his eyes and exhaled. He handed it to its mother. The she-wolf pressed them both to her chest and howled, quietly, not from pain, from something else. When he stepped out of the circle of light, half the valley stood around him, in silence. Ryong stood at the front of the group. Her arms were crossed. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned and walked away. But Do Hwan noticed. Her arms were no longer crossed. They hung at her sides, relaxed. The eldest Minotaur from the council approached him. She looked up at him. She was shorter than him, old, hunchbacked, but with eyes of steel. She said that the well was one thing, but the lives of the mother and children were another. She asked what he needed. Do Hwan replied, he needed land, a plot on the southern slope, seeds, if there were any, tools, if there were any, and permission to do what he knew how to do. The elder looked at him, then she nodded, once, briefly. The first month in the valley was a battle, not against people, not against the Inquisition, against the mud, against hunger, against mistrust. Do Hwan would get up before dawn and go to bed after midnight. Every day was the same, digging, hauling, building, repairing. This young man's body was weak but stubborn. His muscles ached, his back wouldn't straighten, his calluses would burst and fill up again. He didn't complain, not because he was brave, but because he didn't have time. The southern slope had to be prepared before the first frosts, otherwise there would be nothing to plant. And then spring wouldn't bring a harvest. And then the famine would continue. And then people would die, not abstract people, real ones. Hana, who weighs half as much as a normal girl her age, the wolf cubs he took in the night before last, the old Minotaur from the council, whose legs are swollen from malnutrition. He started with water. He dug a channel from a mountain stream to the southern slope. Simple, open, made of stones and clay. He worked for 10 days. Yuna helped. Silently, she came in the morning. She left in the evening. She hauled stones he couldn't lift. She was strong, very strong, even in her condition. Do Hwan watched as she lifted with one hand a boulder that had taken him 5 minutes to budge, and thought that if these girls were fed properly and given rest, they would be invincible. On the 11th day, the channel began to flow. Water ran down the slope, a thin trickle, but it flowed. Do Hwan stood and watched it as if it were a miracle. Yuna stood beside him and watched too. Then she said she should have broken his nose earlier, back when he was walking toward them, by the ravine. He asked why. She replied that now she hauls rocks every day, and all her nails have broken, every single one. Do Hwan looked at her hands, roughened with broken nails. He took the leftover fat he'd rendered from the fish heads out of his pocket. He handed it to her. He said that if she rubbed it in at night, it would feel better. Yuna looked at the jar, at him at the jar. She took it, she walked away. Her ears were red. The soil was heavy, but not hopeless. Do Hwan found manure, old manure from the mountain goats that roamed the upper slopes. He collected it by the bucketful, mixed it with the soil, added ash from campfires, and added crushed bones he found near old fire pits. A primitive fertilizer, but it worked. After a week, the soil became softer, darker, more alive. There were almost no seeds. Mavra found a small bag of grain at one of the elder matriarch's homes, old grain, maybe 5 years old. Do Hwan sorted through every grain by hand. He threw out the dead ones, kept the living ones. There turned out to be less than half, but it's enough. It should be enough. He planted his first garden bed, turnips, onions, something local that looked like millet. He watered it, covered it with grass to protect it from the frost. He stood up, he looked at it, a small square of wet earth on a vast, empty hillside. Ridiculous, absurd. But it was a start. He baked bread on the 12th day, not from wheat, from roots he found by the river. He dried them, ground them into flour between stones, added water, ash instead of baking soda, kneaded the dough, baked it on a hot stone by the fire. The result was a flat bread, flat, gray, tough, but it was bread. The first real bread in the valley in years. He broke it into pieces, handed them out, a piece for each of them, to the little one. Hana took her piece. She sniffed it, took a bite. Her eyes grew huge. She looked at Do Hwan, then at the bread, then back at him, and she began to cry, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto the bread. Do Hwan turned away. Again. Because if he looked, he'd start crying himself, and he couldn't. He was the only one here who had to look like he knew what he was doing. Mavra watched him. Every day, she didn't interfere, she didn't help, she just observed. She was the queen who had lost her kingdom, who had been betrayed by her own people, who had spent 300 days inside a cow's body. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Not completely. Trust, 22%. That's what the system showed. But she watched, and when he sat down by the fire in the evening and collapsed from exhaustion, she silently placed a mug of hot water with herbs next to him. He didn't know where she got in the mug. He didn't ask. He just drank. Once he fell asleep, sitting up, right by the fire. He slumped to one side. He woke up in the morning covered with a heavy cloak. Maureen's, the only one. She was sitting next to him, without a cloak, out in the cold. He wanted to say something. She raised her hand. She said he needed to eat more, that he was losing weight, that if he collapsed, there would be no one left to repair the wells or bake bread. Her voice was steady, commanding, regal. But there was something gentle in her eyes. He nodded. He promised. He knew he was lying, but she knew it too. And they both fell silent. Soa finally spoke to him. In the 3rd week, she approached him. She smiled that smile that meant nothing. Professional, beautiful, empty. She said she wanted to help. She asked how she could be of use. Do Hwan looked at her hands, slender, white, without calluses, hands that had never worked in the fields, hands that had done other things. He didn't dwell on it. He said he needed someone who could do the math. His head was filled with dozens of numbers, supplies, expenses, number of mouths to feed, number of seeds, how much water is used each day, how much firewood, how many days until the first frost. He couldn't keep it all in his head. Soa blinked. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected him to ask her to cook, or clean, or entertain, or... No, he asked her to count, because she had the sharpest mind of anyone he'd ever seen in this valley. She asked how he knew. He replied that he'd seen how she looked at people, how she gauged distances, how she counted the steps to the door of any room. That's how people who are used to surviving by their wits count. Soa stopped smiling for the first time. Her true face was weary, beautiful, but weary. She nodded. She said she would keep. She became the best accountant Do Hwan could have imagined. Within 3 days, she knew every sack of grain, every bundle of dried herbs, every coil of rope. She kept records on birch bark with a charcoal stick in neat, beautiful handwriting. Do Hwan looked at her records and thought that in his world she would have become the CFO of a major company. Here she was counting turnips, but she counted them flawlessly. One evening, He said this out loud. He said she had beautiful handwriting, just like that, in passing, as a statement of fact. So-a froze. She blinked, her cheeks flushed. She muttered that it was nonsense, and she left. Yuna, who was sitting nearby and cleaning a knife, looked at Do Hwan. She looked at So-a walking away, and she snorted quietly, not out of malice, out of understanding. Hana began to follow him around, quietly, like a shadow. He walked out into the field. She followed him. He walked toward the stream. She followed him. He turned around. She stopped. She averted her eyes. She fiddled with the edge of her broken wings. He didn't shoo her away. He didn't ask why. He just gave her small tasks. Bring some water. Hold this. See if that turnip over there is growing. She carried out every task with desperate seriousness, as if her life depended on it. One evening, he found a long reed by the river, straight, dry. He sat down by the fire and began to carve, with the knife they'd finally given him, little holes, one after another, small, close together. Yuna asked what he was doing. He replied that he was making a flute. Yuna asked why. He didn't answer. He worked for an hour. He tried it on. He blew into it. The sound was high-pitched and clear. He called out to Hana. She came over. He held out the flute to her. He said he'd made it especially for her. The spacing between the holes was just right for her fingers. Short, small, but precise. She could play what no one else could play because she had the fingers for it. Precisely for that. Hana took the flute. She looked at it. She looked at him. She raised it to her lips and began to play. The melody was simple. 3 notes. 4 or 5. But there was something about it that made everyone fall silent. Yuna stopped sharpening her knife. So-a looked up from her birch bark notes. Mavra turned around by her campfire. Even the night birds in the mountains fell silent. Hana played and cried at the same time. Tears streamed down her cheeks while her fingers moved with confidence, precisely as if she'd been doing this her whole life, as if she'd been waiting for this little flute for 17 years. Do Hwan sat and listened, and he thought that for this alone it had been worth digging the well, hauling stones, sleeping only 3 hours a night for this very moment, when the girl they called Tainted plays music that silences the mountains. The next morning, after the night with the flute, an old Minotaur from the council came to see him. That very one, with the steely eyes. She stood there, she looked at the garden beds, at the canal, at Hana, who was sitting on a rock and quietly playing. Then she said that the council had decided. They were giving him more land, the entire southern slope, and whatever tools were available. Not many, but there were some. Do Hwan thanked her. He asked if he could request one more thing. She raised an eyebrow. He said he needed helpers, volunteers, those who want to work the land, not by order, by choice. The old Minotaur snorted. She said there wouldn't be many willing to work under a human's command? Du Hwan smiled. He said he wouldn't be giving orders. He'd show them. And then they could do it themselves or not. That was their right. The old Minotaur looked at him for a long time. Then she left. The second month began with a fight. The she-wolves against the Minotaurs. Over meat. A hunting party of she-wolves had brought back 3 wild goats from the mountains. The Minotaur said the catch belonged to everyone. The she-wolves said they were the ones who caught them. The Minotaur said the land belonged to them, word for word, fist for fist. When Do Hwan ran over at the sound of the screams, 2 she-wolves were lying on the ground with their heads smashed in. One Minotaur was clutching her broken horn. Yuna stood in the center, baring her teeth, eyes yellow, claws extended. Opposite her stood a Minotaur from Ryong's band, twice as large, with a fist the size of Yuna's head. Between them lay 3 dead goats in the dust. Du Hwan stepped between them. Yuna snarled at him, told him to get lost. It wasn't his business. Du Hwan didn't budge. He looked at Yuna. He looked at the Minotaur. He looked at the carcasses. Then he spoke, quietly, calmly, in that voice. He said that the meat wasn't the main thing. He said that 3 goats meant 3 days' worth of food for everyone. And if he showed them how to properly butcher, salt, and smoke them, then 3 goats would last 3 weeks. Then he said that if the she-wolves knew how to hunt and the Minotaurs knew how to butcher, maybe they should work together. Everyone should do what they do best. Yuna clenched her fists. The Minotaur clenched her fists. They both looked at him as if they wanted to kill him specifically, but neither struck, because he stood between them, unarmed, fearless, with dirty hands and a turnip in his pocket. It's hard to hit a man with a turnip sticking out of his pocket. He butchered the goats himself. He showed them how to separate the meat from the bone, how to skin them without damaging it, how to trim the fat, how to salt it. He found rock salt in the mountains. He broke off some, rubbed it into the meat, hung it on poles over the smoke. Yuna stood nearby and watched. An hour later, she began to help. By evening, 3 Minotaurs had joined them, silently, no apologies, but they worked together until Hwan distributed the smoked meat equally. Each group got its share, the she-wolves and the Minotaurs alike. He gave the hides to those who were colder. He left the bones for broth, the offal for the dogs and puppies. He didn't throw anything away, absolutely nothing. The old midwife wolf looked at him and shook her head. She said he treated the goat like a priest treats a relic. Do Hwan shrugged. He said the goat had given its life. The least they could do was use every last bit. After that day, he introduced a rule. He didn't order it. He suggested it. Everything that's hunted is divided equally. Whoever hunts it gets first choice of a piece, but not the biggest one. The rest is divided equally. The she-wolves grumbled, the Minotaurs grumbled, but they shared because the alternative was a fight, and after a fight, someone ends up with a cracked skull and can neither hunt nor work, and then everyone goes even hungrier. The logic was simple, so simple that no one had thought of it before. Because before there was no one who would step between 2 snarling groups with a turnip in their pocket and suggest they talk it out. In the 3rd week of the 2nd month, a more serious problem arose. Slave traders. 4 of them. People. They appeared at the northern pass on horseback, in leather armor, with swords, with nets. Do Hwan was the first to spot them. He was in the field, alone. It was morning. They rode along unhurriedly, looking around, counting. One of them spotted the valley and whistled. He turned to the others and said something Do Hwan couldn't make out. But he understood from the gesture they were looking down at the settlement as if it were prey. Do Hwan stood up. He wiped his hands and walked toward them. Alone, unarmed, with a shovel. They stopped. They looked down at him. The leader asked what kind of place this was and who he was. Do Hwan replied that it was a farm, and that he was a shepherd. The leader laughed. He said that they were looking for beast girls, that they'd heard there was a settlement in the mountains, that they'd pay 5 gold pieces for a healthy young she-wolf. 10 for a Minotaur. Do Hwan stood and listened. His expression didn't change. Inside, everything was burning. But his face didn't change. He said there were no beast girls here, just him and his cows. The leader looked past him down into the valley. He saw smoke rising from campfires. He saw figures. He smirked. He said the cows don't walk on 2 legs, and he urged his horse forward. Do Hwan didn't move. He stood on the trail with a shovel. The chief slave trader looked down at him lazily, as if at an insect. He drew his sword. And at that moment, Yuna and 4 more she-wolves emerged from behind the rocks on both sides, silently, without a cry. Their eyes were yellow. Their claws were bared. They stood on the rocks above the horsemen. The horses snorted. They began to stamp their hooves. One of the slave traders looked back and turned pale. Behind him on the trail stood Mavra, standing tall, black horns, golden eyes, her arms folded across her chest. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, 2 meters of motionless, dark fury. The head slave trader looked at her. He looked at the she-wolves above. He looked at Do Hwan with the shovel. He slowly sheathed his sword, turned his horse around, rode off. His men followed him, quickly, without looking back. When they disappeared behind the pass, Yuna jumped down from the cliff. She approached Do Hwan. She asked why he had gone out alone, unarmed. Why had he taken the risk? Do Hwan replied that if they had seen the she-wolves first, they would have returned with reinforcements. But as it was, they had seen a shepherd with a shovel, alone. Pathetic, not worth the squad's time. They'd come back and say they'd only found some madman with cows. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she said he wasn't pathetic, he was crazy, but not pathetic. And she walked away, but her tail, which usually stuck up aggressively, was lowered and swayed gently like he was at home. Mora came over later when everyone had left. She stood beside him, silently. Then she said he could have died. Do Hwan nodded. She said she didn't like that. He replied that neither did he. She turned to face him. She looked him in the eyes. She said that if he died, everything would fall apart. Not the farm, not the principality. Everything? Because he's the only one who remembers everyone's name, the only one who knows that Hana is allergic to clover, that Yoon needs 2 blankets, that the old midwife doesn't eat after sunset. If he were gone, no one would know, and everything would fall apart. Do Hwan looked at her. He wanted to say she was exaggerating, but she wasn't exaggerating, and he knew it. He nodded. He promised to be more careful. Mora nodded. Then she quietly added that this morning he'd forgotten to set out her mug of warm milk with honey. Do Hwan froze. She hadn't asked for it. He'd started doing it on his own. Every morning, starting on the 5th day in the valley, he found goat's milk, he found wild honey, he warmed it up, he set it next to her spot by the fire without a word. And this morning, he forgot. Because he'd spotted the slave traders and run off. She noticed. She'd been counting every morning. He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the mountains. Her face was stony, regal. But the very tip of her left horn trembled slightly. He said there would be 2 mugs tomorrow, for today and for tomorrow. She nodded. She walked away. And he could have sworn he saw the corner of her mouth twitch. He made his first cheese at the end of the 2nd month, not from cow's milk, from goat's milk. Mountain goats roamed the upper slopes wild, belonging to no one, until Hwan decided to stop chasing them. Instead, he found a spot where they drank water. He set up a feeding trough nearby. He sprinkled some salt. The goats came. After 3 days, they stopped running away. After a week, they let him get within arm's reach. He began to milk them, not forcefully, gently, one by one, in that voice, calmly, steadily. The milk was rich, thick, fragrant. He collected it in a clay pot he'd molded himself from river clay and fired over a campfire. Crooked, ugly, but it held. He added rennet to the milk. He found it in the stomach of a kid that a golden eagle had killed. Unpleasant, but necessary. He warmed it, waited for it to curdle, strained the whey through a cloth, salted it, shaped it, left it for 2 days. When the cheese was ready, he cut it into pieces. Small, thin. I let each of them try a piece. Mavra first. She took a piece, sniffed it, took a bite, closed her eyes, chewed slowly. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him with that gaze that made his throat tighten. She said the last time she'd eaten cheese was 300 years ago, before the Great Purge, when she was still a princess. When her mother was alive, when the world was different, Do Hwan remained silent, because what could one say? Yuna grabbed her piece and shoved it whole into her mouth. She chewed with her cheeks puffed out. Her eyes were ablaze. She demanded seconds. Soa ate in small bites, neatly, gracefully, just like at court. Then she licked her fingers. She glanced around, made sure no one had seen. Do Hwan had seen. He looked away. Hana ate her piece for 15 minutes. She pinched off crumbs, placed them on her tongue, closed her eyes, as if she were memorizing it, as if she were afraid of forgetting the taste. Do Hwan watched them, their faces, and thought that for this, it had been worth picking through a goat's stomach. By the end of the 2nd month, the valley had changed, imperceptibly, gradually, but it had changed. The garden beds were turning green, the canal was working, the well provided clean water, goats grazed on the upper slopes and gave milk. Meat was smoked and salted. Bread was baked every 3 days, not enough to fill them up. Far from enough, but hunger had retreated a step. From the valley's eyes, that empty, glassy expression, the kind seen in creatures who have stopped waiting for tomorrow, had vanished. The children began to play, for the first time in a long time. Do Hwan heard children's laughter at dawn and stopped in his tracks. He stood and listened, a minute, 2. Then he walked on, but he smiled all day long. The 3rd month brought the first real harvest. The turnips were small, crooked, but edible. Do Hwan pulled the first one out of the ground and stared at it for a long time, dirty, ugly. The most beautiful turnip of his life. Yuna stood beside him. She asked why he was smiling like a fool. He held out the turnip to her. She took it, turned it over in her hands, snorted, said she'd seen bigger turnips, but she held it tightly in her hands and didn't give it back. The whole village gathered the harvest, 30 hands in the soil, the baskets filled slowly, turnips, onions, millet, not much, barely enough. But it was their food grown by their own hands on their land. Hwan stood at the edge of the field and counted. Soa counted beside him, with a charcoal mark on birch bark. If they stretched it out over a month, it would be enough. Just barely, but it would be enough. If they added goat's milk and dried meat and fish from the river, it would definitely be enough. Soa looked up. She looked at him. She said the numbers added up. For the first time ever, the numbers added up. He nodded. She smiled. Not a professional smile, a real one. Small, crooked, unfamiliar, as if her face had forgotten how to do it. That same day, the first wedding took place. Not his. 2 she-wolves. In the she-wolf tribe, women could form unions with one another, an old tradition. Before the Great Purge, weddings were celebrations for the whole valley, with songs, with dancing, with food. The last wedding had been 11 years ago. No songs, no food. 2 she-wolves simply sat down next to each other and said they were together now. No one celebrated, until Hwan found out about it by chance. Yuna let it slip. He stopped, asked when. Yuna said tomorrow. He asked if there would be a celebration. Yuna looked at him as if he were crazy. What celebration? There's barely enough food. There's no time, no energy. Do Hwan didn't say anything? He went into the kitchen. He worked all night. By morning, there were 12 flatbreads with honey on the table, a pot of goat cheese, braised turnips with wild garlic, fish broth, herbal tea. It wasn't a feast, but it was more than any of them had seen in recent years. The wedding took place by the main fire. 2 she-wolves stood facing each other. Both wore clean shirts. Their faces were serious. Do Hwan didn't know the ritual. Mora stood between them. She spoke the words, ancient ones, in a language he didn't understand, but they sounded beautiful, heavy, like an oath that weighs more than a stone. Then everyone ate, quietly, slowly. Do Hwan sat off to the side and watched. One of the brides approached him, a young woman, a redhead. She looked like Yuna. She held out a piece of flatbread to him. She said that the godfather was supposed to eat first. Do Hwan was taken aback. He asked, "Which godfather?" She replied, "You," because he had prepared the food, because without him there would be no wedding, because he was the only one who thought a wedding wasn't just words, but a celebration. Do Hwan took the flatbread. He took a bite. It was hot, with honey, delicious. He chewed, but couldn't swallow because his throat had tightened. He turned away. Yuna snorted beside him. She said the godfather's eyes were wet. He said it was from the smoke. Yuna said the bonfire was on the other side. He didn't answer. After the wedding in the valley, something changed. Subtly, imperceptibly. People began to walk with better posture, to speak louder, to laugh more often, as if the wedding had reminded them that life isn't just about survival, that you can eat for more than just to stay alive, that you can find joy, that it's allowed. Even before Hwan saw this, he understood that food isn't just calories. Food is a message. Every flatbread says you're worth cooking for. Every bowl of broth says you're not alone. He knew this from his past life. When he used to bottle feed calves, milk isn't just nourishment. Milk is a touch, warmth, care. The body remembers, and it begins to live, rather than it merely exist. The slave traders returned in the 4th month. Not 4 of them, 12, with bows, with chains, with a cage, on wheels. Do Hwan learned of this from Yuna's sentries? She burst in on him at dawn. Her eyes were yellow. The fur on her ears was bristling. She said there was a detachment at the northern pass. A large one, armed. Do Hwan stood up, got dressed, went outside, looked at the valley, at the garden plots, at the children, at the huts. He thought for a minute. Then he called Mavra. He called Soa. He called Ryong. They sat down. They discussed it. Ryong wanted to fight, to go out and tear them apart. She could have. She was stronger than any two people put together. But Do Hwan said no. If they killed 12, 100 would come. That's just how people are. The slain slave traders would become martyrs, victims. And then it wouldn't be a gang that came. It would be an army. Ryong clenched her fists. She called him a coward. Do Hwan didn't argue. He said he might be a coward, but a living coward with his charges, still alive. Ryong stood up and left. She slammed the door so hard that clay crumbled from the ceiling. The plan was simple. Soa knew people. She knew how they thought. She said that slave trading was a business, not a war. They wouldn't attack if the risk outweighed the profit. They had to make the risk seem high. Do Hwan nodded. They worked all day. Yuna and the she-wolves dug fake trenches around the pass. They built earthen ramparts. They stuck pointed stakes into the ground. Not many, but noticeable. Mavra stood on the highest rock, standing tall, horns, the flag fluttering, visible from the pass, alone, but she looks like an army. Soi set traps along the trails, simple ones, ropes with bells, not dangerous, but noisy. The slave traders would reach the first bend and hear the ringing from all sides, and they'd see the trenches, and they'd see the Minotaur on the rock, and they'd do the math. 12 swords against a fortified camp with lookout towers and a fortress on high ground. Not worth it. They'll turn back. That's exactly what happened. The slave traders reached the first bend. The bells rang out. They stopped. They saw the stakes. They saw the ramparts. They saw Mavra on the cliff. Their leader looked through his binoculars for a long time. Then he lowered them. He said something to his men. They turned around. They drove away. Yuna sat on a rock up above and growled softly. She wanted to fight. Every cell in her body wanted to fight. But she didn't fight, because Do Hwan asked her not to. And she obeyed, not because he ordered her to, because she trusted him. 29%. That's what the system showed. 29. For Yuna, who trusted no one, that was a lot. That evening, Do Hwan sat by the campfire and repaired his shovel. The handle had broken for the third time. Ryong approached. She tossed a bundle of iron rods in front of him. He looked at them. Then at her. She said she'd found them in an old mine on the western slope, that there were more there. He asked why she'd brought them. She replied that his shovel was falling apart, and that it hurt to look at it. Then she left. Do Hwan picked up the rods. He examined them. Iron, rough but malleable. You could make shovel heads out of this? Hoes, knives, sickles, real tools. He needed a forge. He wasn't a blacksmith, but he knew the basics. He'd read about it. He'd seen it. Fire, a hammer, an anvil. He had to try. If there was anyone among the beast girls who remembered the art of blacksmithing, it would change everything. He found a blacksmith 2 days later, or rather, a female blacksmith. An old Minotaur from the council, the very one, with iron eyes. Her name was Terra. She was over 200 years old. She had forged swords before the Great Purge. Then it was banned. She hadn't touched a hammer in 300 years, but her hands remembered. Until Hwan came to her, he laid iron rods before her. He said he didn't need swords. He needed axes, knives, sickles, nails, door hinges. Tara looked at him, at the rods. She picked one up, bent it with her fingers, tested its flexibility. Then she looked at her palms, broad, with calluses that hadn't worn away in 300 years. And she nodded. A week later, they had a forge, a small one, made of stones and clay, with bellows made from goat skins, with an anvil made from a flat boulder. Tara worked from dawn. The sound of the hammer echoed through the valley. The first shovel came out crooked. The second was better. The third was almost straight. By the end of the week, Do Hwan had 5 shovels, 2 sickles, 10 knives, and 1 hoe. He handed out the tools to the workers in the field, silently, one by one in each hand. The Minotaur, who received the first real sickle in 300 years, stood and looked at it as if it were a sacred object. Do Hwan told her it was just a sickle? She replied that it wasn't. It wasn't just a sickle. It was the right to feed oneself. It was a right that had been taken from them, and which had been restored by some skinny man with a turnip in his pocket. By the end of the 4th month, the valley was feeding itself, not to their fill, but without hunger. Turnips, onions, millet, goat's milk, cheese, dried meat, fish, herbal teas. A hot meal every day, clean water every day, Hana's music at sunset every day. Do Hwan kept track. 83 beast girls, 14 children, 7 old women, a total of 104 mouths to feed. He remembered every name, every mouth. He knew that Tara didn't eat onions, that a little she-wolf named Suri was afraid of thunderstorms, that the old foxman had a sore left fang and chewed only on the right side. He knew everything, because he asked, because he watched, because he cared. The shepherd system displayed the valley's overall trust level 34%, 1/3. That was enough for him to feel each one of them. Far away, close by, anxiety, pain, joy, warm spots on the edge of his consciousness. 104 warm spots. His flock. The 6th month began with a visitor, not an enemy, not a slave trader, an old man. He had come on foot from the northern pass, alone, with a mule. On the mule were 2 sacks of flour and a barrel of salt. Yuna's sentries intercepted him on the trail. They brought him to Do Hwan. The old man was thin, gray-haired, with kind eyes and calloused hands. A miller. Do Hwan looked at him and recognized him, not by his face, by his hands. He had seen those hands in the memories of this body's former owner. A miller from the village beyond the pass. The very same man whose millstone the former Do Hwan had repaired for free a month before his exile. He had simply come and fixed it. He hadn't asked for money. He hadn't asked for food. He fixed it and left. The miller called him by name. He said he'd been looking for him, that he'd heard he was in the mountains, that he'd brought flour because he owed him a favor. Do Hwan said he didn't owe him anything. The miller shook his head. He said the millstone was still working, that it was the best repair in 30 years, that he didn't forget a kindness. Then he looked out at the valley, at the vegetable patches, at the smoke rising from the blacksmith's shop, at the wild girl standing in the distance, watching him warily. Not fearfully, warily. The miller set the sacks on the ground. He said he'd be back in a month, that he might bring flour and salt, that in exchange he wanted cheese, goat cheese. He tasted a piece that Do Hwan had given him and said there was no cheese like that anywhere in the area. Do Hwan stood there unable to believe it. Trade. Real trade. The first thread connecting them to the outside world. And it all began with a millstone that a young shepherd boy had repaired for free. The miller's name was Chul. He returned a month later, just as he'd promised, with flour, salt, and news. The news was bad. The Inquisition knew about the valley. Chief Inquisitor Calvin Roche had personally declared anyone harboring the beast girls an enemy of the church. He'd offered a reward, 5 gold pieces for information, 20 gold pieces for a head. Do Hwan listened. He nodded. He thanked Chul. He gave him 3 heads of cheese. Chul took them. He put them on the mule. Then he looked at Do Hwan. He said he was crazy. Do Hwan agreed. Chul shook his head. He mounted the mule. He rode off over the pass, along a trail known only to him. He'll be back. Do Hwan knew that, because Chul is one of those people who remember a kindness. There are people like that. Few. But they exist. News of the Inquisition changed the atmosphere in the valley. Anxiety hung in the air like smoke. Yuna doubled the patrols. Ryung began training combat units. Without asking, without permission, she simply went out to the training ground before dawn and began herding the young minotaurs up the slope. Then the she-wolves, then even the vixens. Do Hwan didn't interfere. He didn't forbid it, but he came to her that evening. He said that training was good, but there needed to be a system. Not an army, a militia, patrols, shifts, rest between shifts, a hot meal after training, treatment for injuries. He offered to help with the organization. Ryan looked down at him. She was 2 heads taller than him. She said he knew a thing or two about combat. He said no, he didn't. But he knew a thing or two about schedules, and about the fact that a tired soldier is a dead soldier. Ryan snorted, but she accepted. A week later, the Valley's militia looked like a real unit. 3 shifts of 8 fighters each, 8 hours on guard duty, 8 hours of training, 8 hours of rest. Hot broth after every shift. Do Hwan cooked it himself, because he knew what was missing from their diet. Protein, fat, minerals. Bone broth provided all of that. Yuna became captain of the first squad. Officially, Ryung appointed her. Not because Yuna was the strongest, because Yuna never slept, because Yuna was everywhere. because Yuna could hear a rustle 3 li away and wake the entire guard with a single short howl. Do Hwan saw how she worked. Every day, every night, without rest. He came to her after her 3rd sleepless night in a row. He sat down beside her. He told her she needed to sleep. She snapped at him. She said she'd sleep when everyone was safe. He replied that if she didn't sleep, she'd collapse in 2 days, and then everyone would be less safe because their captain was lying unconscious. Yuna growled, low, like a wolf-like. Do Hwan didn't budge. He said he wasn't ordering her, he was asking. She could do whatever she wanted, but he was asking because he didn't want her to get sick. Yuna fell silent. She looked at him, yellow eyes, tired, red. Then she looked away. She muttered that it was fine. 4 hours, no more. He said 6, she said 5. He agreed. She lay down, right there, by the fire, curled up. A minute later, she fell asleep. He covered her with a blanket, 2 of them, because she gets cold in her sleep, he remembered. The 7th month brought Ryong, not the Ryong who was already in the valley, her clan. 23 tigresses, beaten, starving. From the south, they'd been traveling for a month, through the mountains, through human lands, at night, hiding. Mercenaries were chasing them. They'd lost 5 along the way. When they reached the pass, Yuna's sentries met them and led them into the valley. Do Hwan stood at the gate and watched as they entered. 23 of them. Some were carrying children in their arms, some were limping. One woman had a broken leg, bandaged with rags, crooked, poorly. Do Hwan approached her first. He placed his hand on her leg. Diagnosis: a closed fracture of the shin. It had healed incorrectly. It needed to be broken again and set properly. He looked into her eyes. He told her he would fix it. It would hurt, but he would fix it. She looked at him, at the person, at the man, with hatred and fear. Then she looked at Ryan. Ryan nodded once. Briefly, the tigress relaxed, not completely, but enough. He worked all day. He examined each of the 23. Fractures, dislocations, infections, exhaustion, frostbite. One was 6 years old, a little tigress with striped ears and eyes that had seen far too much for a 6-year-old. Do Hwan crouched down in front of her. He smiled. He asked her name. She didn't answer. She hid behind an adult's leg. He didn't press the issue. He took a piece of cheese out of his pocket. He placed it in his palm. He held it out. She looked at the cheese, then at him, then back at the cheese. Then she quickly snatched it up, shoved it into her mouth, chewed with her cheeks puffed out. Her eyes were huge, alert, like a little animal's. He stood up, walked away, didn't look back. That evening, Ryong came to see him. She stood in the doorway, silently. Then she said the little girl's name was Mi, that her mother had died on the way there, that Mi hadn't spoken since then. She'd been silent for 2 months. Do Hwan nodded. He said he'd talked to Hana. Ryong raised an eyebrow. He explained. Hana plays the flute. The children are drawn to her by the sound. Maybe Mi will come too. Ryong looked at him, then at her hands. Then she said she wasn't good with children, that she didn't know what to do, that her children had died a long time ago, that she didn't finish. She turned away. She left. Do Hwan stood there for a moment. Then he went after her. He found Mavra. He asked her to make some hot milk. A lot of it. 23 cups and 1 small one, with honey. A week later, Mi started talking. Not to Do Hwan, to Hana. Hana was playing the flute by the stream. Mi stood off to the side, every day, in silence. On the 4th day, she came closer. On the 5th, she sat down next to her. On the 6th, she rested her head on Hana's lap. On the 7th, she said quietly that she wanted to play too. Hana looked at Do Hwan. He nodded. Hana made a tiny flute. A very tiny one, just right for the fingers of a 6-year-old tigress. Mi blew into it. The sound was hoarse, clumsy. Mi blew into it again. Better. Ryong was standing around the corner of the hut. She thought no one could see her. Do Hwan could see her. He saw the matriarch tiger, who had outlived her 3 cubs, who had forbidden herself from forming attachments, standing around the corner, listening to a stranger's daughter on a flute, and her hands were trembling. Do Hwan approached her. She didn't turn around. He stood beside her. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he needed help, that he had a foundling in his care, brought in with the last group of refugees, a half-breed. A little one. There was no one else to feed him. He can't handle it. Ryong turned to face him. Her eyes were hard, wet. She said she was a warrior, not a nanny. Do Hwan held out the bundle to her, small, warm, squeaking. He said he only needed 5 minutes to hold him while he warmed up the milk. Ryong took the bundle, mechanically, like picking up a weapon, with a familiar motion. She looked at the tiny face. The bundle stopped squeaking, yawned, grabbed her finger. Ryong froze. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Du Hwan left to warm the milk. He returned 20 minutes later. Ryan was standing in the same spot. The bundle was asleep in her arms. She was rocking him, slowly, gently, as if he were something fragile. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were red. Du Hwan held out his hands to take him. Ryan shook her head. She said 5 minutes hadn't passed yet. He didn't argue. She had been holding him for 8 years, but he would find that out later. The valley was growing. 127 residents, 3 villages, the first, the main one, the second on the southern slope near the fields, the third to the west near the mine where Tara had found a new vein. A good one, a rich one, iron, a little copper. The forge was in operation every day. Tara took on 2 apprentices, young minotaurs, strong ones, who forged shovels and knives, nails, hinges, pots. Simple things, necessary things. Hwan made plans. He sketched on the ground with a stick. Soa transferred the drawings onto birch bark, garden beds, fields, roads between the villages, a place for a future infirmary, a place for a school, a place for a wall, not a fortress, walls, fences, so the goats wouldn't wander off. And so outsiders would see that this was the border. This is where their land begins. He thought about it in words he didn't say out loud. Their land, not his, theirs. But for some reason, those words made him feel warm, like the warm milk with honey he set next to Mavra every morning. Every morning, without fail. The first year ended in the spring. The snow melted from the mountains in ragged strips. The stream swelled. The southern slope turned green in a week. Do Hwan stood on the pass and looked down at the valley from above. 3 villages, fields, a smithy with smoke rising from it, a wall around the perimeter, goats on the slopes, children by the stream, smoke from campfires. He counted. 142 residents. 7 Minotaur blacksmiths, 23 farm workers, 24 female guards in 3 shifts, an infirmary with 3 beds, a school for 20 children. He wasn't building a principality. He was building a farm. But the farm was growing and becoming something bigger, without his permission, on its own, because when people are fed and safe, they start building. That's the law. It works in any world. Baron Wallace from the neighboring province had sent a messenger. The letter was short. The Baron knew about the valley, knew about the beast girls, knew they had iron, and he wanted to take it, not to trade for it, to take it. The letter gave them 3 days to open the gates and let his retinue in, or he would come himself. Du Hwan read the letter, folded it, put it in his pocket. Ryung stood nearby. She said the Baron had 300 swordsmen, cavalry, archers, siege ladders. The valley's wall wouldn't hold. Du Hwan nodded. 300 swordsmen against 24 female warriors. Even considering that each of them was worth 5 men, the odds were bad. Soa did the math. Bad was putting it mildly. Hopeless. Du Hwan thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he called for Mavra. He asked if she knew anything about Baron Wallace. Mavra knew, a little. Wallace is petty, greedy, not stupid. He loves hunting, dogs, horses. He has exactly as much power as the church allows him. He fears the Inquisition, but greed is stronger than fear. Du Hwan nodded. He asked what kind of dogs he had. Mavra looked at him strangely. She replied that they were hunting dogs, greyhounds. He values them more than people. He has one that's special, famous. A white female named Alba, the winner of 3 tournaments. The Baron had brought her from the capital. He loved her like a daughter. Du Hwan smiled, that smile that frightened Soa. Quiet, calm, with a plan behind his eyes. On the 4th day, instead of the Baron's army, a single horseman rode up to the valley. Not a soldier, a servant, exhausted, on an exhausted horse. He wasn't looking for the valley. He was looking for the shepherd. That very one. the one the miller Chul had told him about. Because Alba was dying, a twisted intestine, 3 days of agony. The Baron's doctors were powerless. The Baron promised gold to anyone, even beastmen, even demons, as long as Alba survived. Chol said he knew one person. The servant arrived. Do Hwan listened. He nodded. He packed a bag. He put in a knife, cloth, thread, herbs. He turned to Mora. She said he wouldn't go, not alone, not to the Baron who had 300 swords. Do Hwan replied that he would go, alone, because if he cures Alba, those 300 swords won't come. Mavra clenched her fists. Her horns darkened. She was angry. But she understood. Yuna said she would go with him. He refused. She would follow behind, unnoticed. To provide cover, Yuna bared her teeth. He didn't argue. Fine. Baron Wallace's castle was 2 days' journey away. Stone. Old, with towers, with flags. Do Hwan entered through the main gate. Small, skinny, dirty, in patched clothes, carrying a bag. The guard looked at him as if he were a vagrant. She let him through, only because a servant shouted that he was the physician. The Baron was waiting in the courtyard. Tall, fat, a red face, small, angry eyes. He looked at Do Hwan. He grimaced. He said he'd been expecting someone more respectable. Do Hwan didn't answer. He asked where the dog was. They led him to the stable. Alba was lying on the straw, white, beautiful, huge, and dying. Her belly was swollen. Her eyes were cloudy. Her breathing was shallow. Do Hwan knelt down beside her. He placed his palm on her belly. Diagnosis: intestinal obstruction. Necrosis had set in. If he didn't operate within the next few hours, it would be too late. He worked for 3 hours. By candlelight, alone. He didn't let anyone in. He made an incision, uncoiled the intestine, removed the dead tissue, rinsed it out. He sutured the incision. Alba lay motionless. He spoke to her in that voice, quietly, evenly. When he finished, he went out into the courtyard. His hands were covered in blood. His face was ashen with exhaustion. The Baron stood waiting, his eyes wild. Do Hwan said the dog would live, but she needed rest. No food for 3 days, then only liquid porridge, plain water, no meat for a week. The Baron blinked. Then he ran to the stable. Do Hwan sat down on a step and closed his eyes. Yuna was sitting on the roof of the stable, invisible. He knew she was there. He felt a warm spot on the edge of his consciousness. The Baron returned. His eyes were wet. He stood before Do Hwan, a burly man, wearing rings, with a sword at his belt. He stood before the skinny shepherd and said, "Ask for whatever you want." Do Hwan looked at him, said he didn't need anything, just that the Baron leave the valley alone, not send soldiers, not touch the beast girls, just leave them be. The Baron froze. Then he laughed, nervously, said that the shepherd was bargaining. Do Hwan shook his head. He said he wasn't bargaining, he was asking, because the people living there were the ones he would come to treat if their dogs got sick. The Baron looked at him for a long time. Then he sat down beside him. He was silent. He asked if it was true that they had cheese. Do Hwan said they did, goat cheese. The Baron said he loved goat cheese. Do Hwan proposed a trade, cheese and ironware, in exchange for grain and cloth. The Baron thought for a minute. Then he held out his hand. Do Hwan shook it. The Baron's hand was twice as big as his, but his grip was firm, almost gentle. He returned to the valley 4 days later, with a cart of grain, with 2 bales of cloth, with a small barrel of oil, and with a letter from the Baron in which he promised not to touch the valley as long as Alba was alive. Soa read the letter. She raised an eyebrow. She said that as long as Alba was alive, it was an unreliable guarantee. Do Hwan smiled. He said that Alba was young, healthy. With proper care, she'd live another 10 years, and a lot can change in 10 years. Soa looked at him. Then she laughed, quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. It was only the second time he'd ever heard her genuine laughter. Ryong was unhappy. She came to him. She said he'd made a deal with the enemy. Do Hwan replied that a living neighbor is better than a dead enemy. Ryong said the Baron isn't a neighbor. He's a predator, one who's temporarily sated. Do Hwan agreed. He said that as long as the predator is sated, they have time to grow stronger. Ryong. Then she said she hated it when he was right. and she left. But the next day, she doubled the militia's training sessions. Not because she didn't trust the peace, because she trusted Do Hwan and wanted them to be ready when the peace ended. He understood that. She knew it. They didn't discuss it. They just worked. The summer of the first year, the valley was in bloom. The garden beds yielded a second harvest. The goats were multiplying. Cheese was stored in caves. Iron was being forged. Cloth was being sewn. The school was in session. Hana was teaching the children to play the flute. Little Me played better than anyone else. Ryong rocked the foundling in her arms every evening, thinking no one could see her. Everyone saw. No one said anything. Yuna slept for 5 hours, sometimes 6, without a dagger under her pillow, until Hwan noticed it in the 3rd month. He didn't tell her. He simply placed a bunch of dried lavender under her pillow instead of the dagger. She found it. She didn't throw it away. He knew because the bunch was getting more and more crumpled. She crumpled it in her hands as she fell asleep. The 2nd year began with betrayal. Not from the outside, from the inside. 3 vixens from Soa's clan left at night, without warning. They took a sack of grain, 2 knives, and the trail map Soa had been drawing. Yuna discovered what was missing at dawn. She ran to Do Hwan. Her eyes were wild. She said she'd catch up to them. She'd get it back. She'd punish them. Do Hwan raised his hand. He told her to wait. Yuna growled. How could she wait? They'd stolen the map. If they handed it over to the Inquisition, the trails would be revealed, all of them. Do Hwan nodded. He understood, but he ran not towards the gate, but toward Soa. He found her in the hut. She was sitting on the floor, staring at the wall, her face blank. He sat down beside her. He was silent for a moment. Then he asked if she knew. Soa nodded. She said she'd suspected as much. They were dissatisfied, not with the valley, but with them, with her. They believed she'd grown too attached to humans, that she'd lost her fox's instincts, that she'd become tame. Do Hwan asked why she hadn't said anything. Soa turned to him. Her eyes were wet. It was the first time he'd seen her cry. She said she'd been hoping, that she'd gotten used to lying to everyone. But she hadn't gotten used to lying to herself. She'd lied to herself that they would stay, and they left. Do Hwan stood up. He said that a map was a bad thing, but a map could be rendered useless by changing the trails, covering up the old ones, laying new ones, false ones, to confuse the tracks. Soa raised her head. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. Her mind kicked into gear. She said she knew how. Fox cunning. If 3 foxes betrayed them, then 3 dozen foxes could fix it. She stepped out of the hut. An hour later, 15 foxes were working on the trails, filling them in, digging, rearranging stones, setting false markers. Do Hwan watched and thought that Soa was more terrifying than Ryong. Ryong breaks down walls. Soa makes the walls break themselves. The map was of no help to the Inquisition. 3 foxes sold it to the interrogators in exchange for the right to live in the city. The interrogators sent a reconnaissance squad along the trails. 10 nights. They followed the old trails, the ones Soa had rerouted. They wandered for 3 days before returning to their own camp. The squad commander was furious, but there was nothing he could do. The trails were deceptive. Each one led to a dead end, into a swamp, off a cliff, or to nowhere. Do Hwan stood on the pass and watched the detachment leave. Soa stood beside him. She wasn't smiling. Her face was calm, professional, but her tail swayed rhythmically behind her back from side to side. Enough. The church hadn't given up. Supreme Inquisitor Calvin Roche had sent someone new, not a soldier, a preacher, young, fair-haired, handsome, with a cross on his chest, and the holy scriptures in his hands. He came alone, to the valley gates. He asked to be let in. He said he wanted to speak, just to speak. Do Hwan let him in? Ryong was against it. Yuna was against it. Mora was against it. Everyone was against it. Do Hwan let him in. Because if they didn't let in an unarmed preacher, how were they any better than those who wouldn't let them in? The preacher's name was Brother Thomas. He walked through the valley for 2 days. He looked around. He remained silent. On the 3rd day, he requested an audience with the council. He was granted one. He stood before the matriarchs. And he began to speak, eloquently, persuasively, about how the beast girls carried impurity within them, how their very existence defiled the earth, how the crop failure was punishment for their sins, how the only path to salvation was repentance, renouncing their beastly nature, accepting the one son. Do Hwan listened. Ryong gritted her teeth. Yuna clenched her fists. Mora sat motionless, like a stone. When Brother Thomas finished, silence fell. Do Hwan stood up. He approached the preacher and asked a single question. He asked where, in the church's view, the crop failure came from. Brother Thomas replied that it came from the impurity of the beast people. Du Hwan nodded. Then he asked why then there was a harvest in the Beastman's Valley, but none in the lands of the people. Silence. Brother Thomas blinked. Du Hwan continued. He said that the soil was depleted because people were burning down the forests, because they didn't practice crop rotation, because they didn't let the soil rest, because they didn't know that manure isn't dirt but fertilizer, and that if Brother Toma wanted to, he could stay and see for himself, with his own eyes, how turnips grow without prayers, using ordinary manure. Brother Toma stayed for a week. He walked through the fields. He watched. He touched the soil. He tasted the water from the well. He ate bread. He played with the children. On the seventh day, he packed his things. He approached Do Hwan. He said he would write to the investigator that there was no impurity in the valley, only manure. Do Hwan thanked him. He asked if the investigator would believe him. B-Rat Tom shook his head. No, he wouldn't believe it. But he would write it anyway, because it was the truth, and he left. Across the pass, alone, with a cross on his chest and manure on his boots. Mora came to Do Hwan that evening. She said he was taking a risk. That every person he let in was the eyes and ears of the church. Do Hwan replied that every person he let in was one more person who had seen the truth. Mora shook her head. She said that the truth doesn't save anyone. She had lived for 300 years. The truth hadn't saved a single person. Power is what saves. Du Hwan looked at her. He said that cheese saves people. Mora froze. Then she bowed her head. Her horns glinted in the light of the campfire. She asked what cheese had to do with it. He replied that the Baron hadn't touched them because of power, because of cheese, and because of Alba. Miller Shale doesn't come because of strength. It's because of the cheese and the repaired millstone. Brother Toma didn't leave because of his strength. It was because of the manure and the bread. Every time someone eats their food or receives their help, the world gets one step closer. Mora listened. She remained silent. Then she quietly said that he was a naive fool. Du Hwan agreed. She added that he was the most stubborn, naive fool she'd had ever met in 300 years. He agreed too. She paused. Then she said that his milk that morning had been a little warmer than usual. Du Hwan replied that he'd added a ladleful of hot water because it was colder that morning. Mavra turned away. He could see the tip of her horn trembling. That meant she was smiling. He'd learned that over the course of a year. At the end of the summer of the second year, Emily arrived. She didn't come on her own. She was brought in. Yoon's patrols found her on the trail, alone, unarmed, in a torn dress, with a bag of books on her back. She was walking down into the valley on her own, young, 22 years old, blonde hair, big eyes, a frightened face. She said her name was Emily Roach. Yoona heard the last name and drew her knife. Roach. The Inquisitor's sister. Du Hwan stopped Yoona. He looked at Emily. She was standing in front of him. She was trembling, but not from fear, from something else. She said she had run away from her brother, that she couldn't take it anymore, that she had seen things she shouldn't have seen, that she wanted to know the truth. Du Hwan asked what truth. She replied, "Ena truth," because everything she knew turned out to be a lie. The council wanted to execute her, or expel her. Ryung proposed the former, Mavra the latter, Yoona a third option. Soa remained silent, weighing her options. Du Hwan proposed a fourth option. Let her stay. Let her work. Let her see. He wouldn't try to change her mind. He wouldn't explain. He wouldn't prove anything. He'd simply let her see for herself. The valley would do the rest. The council was in an uproar. Ryong said he'd gone mad. Du Hwan replied that perhaps he had, But Emily Roche wasn't just any girl. She was the sister of their greatest enemy. And if she saw the truth and accepted it, it will be more powerful than any army. Ryan snorted, but she said nothing, because somewhere deep down she knew he was right. Emily got a job. A school. 20 children, minotaurs, wolf cubs, tiger cubs, one little vixen, and Mai, who, by that time, was already speaking. A little, quietly. But she was speaking. Emily stood before them. 20 pairs of eyes, horned, eared, tailed, stared at her, the human. She swallowed, opened her book, began to read letters, the alphabet, simple words. The children repeated them, diligently, loudly, with a lisp. An hour later, Me came up to her, tugged at her sleeve, showed her her little flute, asked if she could play after class. Emily looked at the little tigress with striped ears, with huge eyes, who was asking permission to play, just like any child, at any school, in any world. Emily crouched down. She said yes. Me smiled for the first time in front of a stranger. Emily left the school. She walked to the stream, sat down on a rock, and cried for half an hour. Hwan saw her. He didn't approach. He gave her time. That evening he brought her dinner. Braised turnips with cheese. She ate it all without looking up. He left. On the table, next to the empty bowl, was the portion he'd set out that morning, just in case. It, too, was empty. The fall of the second year was warm, golden. The valley breathed. The fields yielded a third harvest. The goats were milked. The cheese was aging. The blacksmith's forge clanged. The children were learning the alphabet. Mora stood on the cliff every evening and looked down. Do Hwan set out milk with honey for her every morning. He checked her scar every third day. Ryan rocked the foundling and pretended his name was simply Little One. Everyone knew she called him Tan when no one was listening. Yuna slept with Lavender under her pillow and had learned to delegate guard duty to the younger ones. Soa kept the ledgers and sometimes smiled when she wasn't paying attention. Hana played the flute and Me played alongside her. Together they made a sound that made the mountains fall silent. Emily taught the children and every evening wrote something in her notebook that Do Hwan didn't see. Quietly, intently, with the look of someone building a new world brick by brick. The silence ended in the third week of fall. Yuna's sentries spotted movement on the eastern pass. Not an army, not slave traders. A lone figure, huge, in a black cloak, with horns. A minotaur. A man, Yuna reported. Mora turned pale. For the first time ever, Do Hwan saw fear on her face. Not alarm, fear. She said one word. A name. Terion. Do Hwan asked who that was. Mavra sat down, heavily, her horns darkened. She said that Terion was her brother, the only surviving male minotaur, the one whom the church had taken as a child, re-educated, broken, turned into a weapon. He serves as an interrogator, Calvin Roche. He is the executioner. He is the one who applied the brand to his own sister. With his own hands, Do Hwan fell silent. He looked at Mora, at her face, at the scar beneath her shoulder blade that he checked every 3 days, the brand that still smoldered slowly, quietly, eating away at the flesh millimeter by millimeter. He knew the brand was killing her, slowly, and now he knew who had applied it. Her brother. He clenched his fists, then unclenched them. He asked Mavra what Tarion wanted. She replied that he wanted her. The brand hadn't worked. She was alive. He had come to finish her off, or to take her away. She didn't know which was worse. Tarion entered the valley at sunset, alone, unarmed, without an army. He was enormous, taller than Mavra, 2.5 meters, black horns, but not smooth like his sisters, covered in runes burned into them, symbols of the church. His eyes were red, not evil, empty, the eyes of a creature that had stopped feeling a very long time ago. He walked through the valley, and no one dared to stand in his way, not even Ryan. She stood there, clenching her fists, but didn't move, because she sensed it. The power, the kind that makes your hair stand on end. Tarion was stronger than any of them, much stronger. He stopped in front of Do Hwan's hut. He looked at the door. Do Hwan came out, small, skinny, dirty, with flour on his hands because he'd been baking bread. He looked up from below, at 2.5 meters of darkness. Tarion looked down at him, as if at an ant. He asked if he was the one they called the Shepherd of Filth. Do Hwan replied that his name was Do Hwan and that he was a shepherd, without filth, just a shepherd. Tarion bowed his head. He asked where his sister was. Do Hwan replied that Mavra was here, but first he would speak with him, with Do Hwan. Tarion watched in silence. Then he sat down, right on the ground, crossing his legs. The ground shook. He was heavy, very heavy. He sat down and waited. Do Hwan sat across from him. They sat in silence. A minute, 2, 5. Do Hwan looked at Tarion, at the runes on his horns, at the scars on his arms, at his empty eyes. He placed his hand on Tarion's knee. Tarion flinched, as if struck. No one had touched him willingly, maybe 10 years, maybe 20. The diagnostic system activated. Do Hwan saw and closed his eyes because what he saw was worse than anything he had ever seen in this world. Tarion's body was shattered from the inside out. The runes on his horns weren't decorations, they were chains. Each rune was burning away his will, piece by piece, year after year. The church hadn't reformed him. The church had burned him from the inside out and filled the void with orders. He hadn't served willingly. He was a slave. Literally, physically. The runes controlled his body, his mind, his will. What remained of the real Tarion was locked away somewhere deep inside. Small, screaming, helpless, Do Hwan withdrew his hand. He opened his eyes. He looked at Tarion. Tarion was looking at him, and for a second, something flashed in his empty eyes, like a spark at the bottom of a well. He said he'd come for his sister, that the interrogator had ordered it, that he had to. His voice was mechanical, even, like a doll's. Do Hwan asked if that was what he wanted. Tarion froze. The question didn't fit within the runes. He'd never been asked if he wanted to. Never. Do Hwan repeated it. Do you want to take your sister away? Tarion was silent for a long time. Then he spoke softly in a different voice. Not mechanical, alive, hoarse. He said no, that he didn't want to, that he wanted her to be safe, that he remembered her as a little girl, when she carried him in her arms, when she sang to him, that he remembered, and that the runes couldn't erase that. They erased everything except that. Mavra stood around the corner of the hut, listening. Do Hwan knew. He sensed it. She stepped out. Tarion looked up. He saw her. He flinched. His entire massive body jerked. The runes on his horns flared red. They hissed. They struggled. Commands against memory. The church against blood. He clutched his horns. He growled. Low. Terrifying. The earth shook. Mavra didn't back down. She stepped forward. She stood before him. She placed her hand on his forehead, between his horns, just as he used to when he was little, rest his head on her lap. She said his name. Quietly, just as she had spoken it 300 years ago. Tarion froze. The runes flickered, faded, flared up again. He groaned. His body thrashed, as if in convulsions. Do Hwan approached. He placed his hands on the runes. Diagnosis. Complete. Deep. He saw every rune, every chain, every knot. He couldn't remove them, couldn't destroy them. He lacked the strength. He lacked the knowledge. But there was one thing he could do. Through his touch, he could send the one thing the system allowed. Warmth. A single fleeting sensation. I'm here. I see you. You're not alone. Tarion froze. He opened his eyes. Red. Wet. He looked at Do Hwan. He looked at his sister and said one word, leave. Then he stood up, turned around, and walked away, toward the pass. Every step was heavy, like walking on glass. The runes were burning. They were pulling him back, toward the valley, toward the order, but he walked away. Every step cost him more than Do Hwan could imagine. Mavra stood and watched his back. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, with her hand outstretched into the void. Do Hwan stood beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there so she would know she wasn't alone. When Tarion disappeared over the pass, Mavra turned to Do Hwan. Her face was stony. Her voice was steady. She said they needed to prepare because Tarion had disobeyed the order, and the church would send someone else, or it would come itself. Do Hwan nodded. He knew war was approaching. Not the kind you could win with a shovel and cheese, a real one. And he didn't know if he was ready, but he knew that 142 warm spots on the edge of his consciousness were waiting for him to find the answer, and he would find it. He had to find it because every spot was a name, and every name was a life, and then he remembered them all. Winter of the second year came early. Snow fell on the valley in a single night. Heavy, wet snow. Do Hwan woke up to the silence, the kind of silence that comes only when the world is blanketed in white. He stepped out of the hut. The valley was white. The fields were hidden. The trails had vanished. Smoke from the chimneys rose straight up into the still air. Beautiful, dangerous. Winter means hunger. Winter means cold. Winter means disease. He stood there and did the math. The supplies would last 2 months if they rationed carefully. If they ran out, he'd have to slaughter the goats, the ones he'd spent half a year taming. He gritted his teeth and went to check the cellars. The supplies were better than he'd feared. Soa had kept perfect records. 3 barrels of salted fish, 2 sacks of millet flour, dried meat, cheese, turnips and sand, bundles of onions, goat butter and pots, honey, salt. He counted everything. Twice. Soa stood beside him, silently waiting. He said it would last 3 months, if rationed properly. She nodded. She'd already done the math. The numbers added up. He looked at her. She was standing there in a thick goatskin jacket. Her tail was wrapped around her waist for warmth. Her nose was red from the cold. Beautiful. He thought that, and immediately looked away, because he couldn't. Because there were 142 of them, and if he loved one more than the rest, it would hurt them all. And that was the truth, and that truth made him want to howl. But he didn't howl. He was counting the turnips. The first loss happened in the 3rd week of winter. The old matriarch wolf, the one who had been on the council. She was over 300. Her body gave out at night, quietly, in her sleep, until Hwan found her in the morning, cold, peaceful, with a face that showed no pain. He stood over her and felt something snap. A warm spot at the edge of his consciousness went out. It just went out, like a candle being blown out. He sank to his knees. He placed his hand on her forehead. Cold, the diagnostic system was silent. There was nothing left to diagnose. It was over. He sat there for 5 minutes. Then he stood up. He went outside. He told Mora. Mora closed her eyes. She nodded. They buried her on the eastern slope, under an old tree. Hana played the flute fiddle. We were nearby. 2 voices. 2 faint sobs. The valley was silent. Snow fell on the fresh mound. 2 days later, the second one passed away. A young Minotaur, 20 years old, pneumonia. Do Hwan fought for 3 days straight. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat. Herbs, compresses, hot steam. He did everything he knew, everything he remembered, everything he could. She died at dawn on the 4th day, quietly, holding his hand. He sat there, holding her dead hand for another hour because he couldn't let go. The second light went out, another candle. He stepped out of the hut. Yuna was standing by the door. She saw his face. She didn't say a word. She just stood there beside him, shoulder to shoulder. He could feel her warmth. 36 and 6. Alive. Warm. Right there. The 3rd loss broke him. Not an old one. Not sick. A young vixen from the Soa clan. Cheerful? Boisterous. With a red tail and a loud laugh. She'd gone up the upper slope to gather brushwood, alone, against the rules. But they were running out of firewood. An avalanche came without warning, white, silent, fast. Yuna found her an hour later. She dug her out, too late. By the time Hwan reached her, he stood over the body and couldn't breathe. The 3rd stain, the 3rd candle. He knew her, knew she loved to sing, knew she was afraid of spiders, knew she secretly fed the stray cat she'd brought back from the pass. He knew her. And he hadn't protected her. He went into his cabin, closed the door, sat down on the floor, and didn't come out. 1 day, 2, 3. On the 4th day, he stopped eating. On the 5th, he stopped answering. Mora stood behind the door. She knocked. He didn't open it. Yuna tried to break down the door. He asked her to leave. His voice was quiet. Dead. She left, because he asked her to. And that was the worst part of all, that he could still ask for things, but could no longer live. On the sixth day, the door opened. It wasn't him who opened it. It was Ryan. She kicked the door down with a single blow. She went in. She grabbed him by the collar. She lifted him up. He hung in her hand like a rag. Skinny, gray, with lifeless eyes. She set him on his feet. She held him up because he couldn't stand on his own. Then she spoke. Briefly, harshly, she said he had no right, that 139 spots were still burning, that Hana hadn't eaten for 3 days because he wouldn't come out, that Yuna hadn't slept for 6 nights, that Soa was crying over the ledgers and the numbers were blurring, that little me had stopped playing, that Mavra stood on the cliff every evening waiting for his mug, an empty cliff, empty hands. Ryan said he could grieve. He has the right. But not like this, not by shutting himself away, not alone, because he himself taught them that loneliness kills, and if he dies in this hut from hunger and guilt, he won't be killing himself. He'll kill 139. Do Hwan looked at her, at the tigress who had outlived 3 children, who knew this pain better than anyone else, who had forbidden herself to become attached, and who had come for him. Carried him out the door, lifted him up like a kitten, because he mattered to her, and that meant she had become attached. Again, despite her vow, she had grown attached to a skinny shepherd with flour on his hands. He swallowed hard, closed his eyes, opened them, nodded, said he needed a minute. Ryan set him down, let him go, went out. He stood there, swayed, then straightened up, washed his face, stepped out into the light. The sun hit his eyes, white, winter sun. He squinted. He opened them. Everyone was standing by the hut, not all 139 of them, but many. They stood there, looking at him. He looked at them, at Mavra, with her stony face and trembling horns, at Yuna, with her red eyes and clenched fists, at Soa, who for the first time wasn't smiling or hiding behind a mask, at Hana, who was clutching her flute to her chest, at Ryan, who stood behind them with her arms crossed and her cheeks wet, at Emily, who was holding little Me's hand. He opened his mouth. He wanted to say something, an apology, an explanation, a promise, but nothing came out. Instead of words, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He went to the kitchen, he lit the fire, and he started cooking. He cooked for 2 hours, using the last of their supplies, whatever was left. For more, a flatbread with honey, because it reminded her of her childhood. For Yoon, meat on the bone, because she loved to gnaw on it. For Soa, a thin omelet with herbs, because she couldn't stand coarse food. For Hana, warm milk. For Ryan, a spicy pepper soup, because she missed the South. For Emily, a serving of stewed turnips with cheese, because that was the first thing he ever cooked for her. For little me, porridge with honey, because she's 6 and she deserves something sweet. A dish for each of them, for her memory, for her pain. He carried everything out of the kitchen, set it on the table. No one ate. For a minute. Ryong stared at her bowl. Then she lifted her head. She looked at him, and she said what Mora would say a year from now, but in different words. She said he was a fool, that she hated him, and that if he closed the door one more time, she'd tear the whole hut down. Then she started eating, and everyone started eating, and Do Hwan ate too. For the first time in 6 days, the food tasted bitter, because 3 of the embers weren't burning, but 139 were, and he would feed them, as long as he could. As long as he was breathing. Spring of the 2nd year came late. But it came. The snow melted. The ground thawed. Do Hwan went out onto the southern slope and knelt down. He touched the soil, moist, alive, ready. He closed his eyes and let himself breathe it in, the scent of the earth after winter. The most honest scent in the world. A promise. There's a lot of work to do. Let's get started. He doubled the area under cultivation. Now there were 40 women working in the fields. Tara had forged a real plow, heavy, made of iron. 2 minotaurs pulled it across the field, faster than any ox. The furrows ran straight, deep. Do Hwan followed behind, scattering seeds. New ones. Cheol brought wheat, real wheat, the first wheat in the valley in 300 years. Do Hwan held the grains in his palms and thought that right now he was holding the future. 140 grams of the future. He planted every grain himself, watered it, covered it, and waited. The church didn't wait. In the third week of spring, news arrived. Chul brought it, pale, frightened. Calvin Roche was assembling an army, not a reconnaissance unit, not a detachment, an army, 1,000 swords, 3 orders of knights, siege engines. He had declared a crusade against the shepherd of filth. The church needed a victory. 3 years of crop failure. People are starving. They're angry. They're looking for someone to blame. Calvin gave them someone to blame. The Beast Maidens, and their shepherd, the perfect scapegoat, an age-old scheme. It always works. Do Hwan listened? He nodded. He thanked Chul. He gave him some cheese. Chul took it with a trembling hand and said that this time he might not return, that they might be following him. Do Hwan placed a hand on his shoulder. He said that he had already done more than anyone could have asked, that if he decided not to return, that was his right. Chul looked at him, then at the valley, at the children by the stream, at Hana with her flute, at me beside her. He said he would return, and he left. The council convened that same evening. It was a full meeting. All the matriarchs were present. Ryong, Mavra, Yuna, Soa, Do Hwan, and Emily. Their faces were somber. Ryong spoke bluntly. 1,000 swords against 60 fighters from the valley. The wall won't hold. The mountain trails will slow them down, but won't stop them. If the army reaches the valley, it'll all be over. Yuna clenched her teeth. She suggested leaving, abandoning the valley, leading the people into the mountains, deeper, higher, where they won't find us. Mavra shook her head. She said there was nowhere to go. The mountains end. Beyond the mountains lies the sea. They're cornered, silence heavy, long, until Hwan spoke up. He said they had something Calvin's army didn't have. Friends. Everyone looked at him, he explained. Baron Wallace. Alba is alive. The treaty is still in effect. The Baron won't fight for them, but he won't let the army pass through his lands either. This will force Calvin to take the long way, through a mountain pass. Narrow, long, 1,000 swords would stretch out over 5 days' march. Not an army, a column, vulnerable. Soa raised her head. Her eyes sparkled. She said we could make the column even longer. False trails, ambushes, traps, not to kill, to delay. Every day lost is a ration eaten. That means fatigue. That means doubt. An army that marches for a week instead of 3 days arrives angry, hungry, and starts asking questions. Why are we here? What are we fighting for? Ryan nodded. For the first time, she agreed with the fox. She said that if we stretch out the column, we can strike at it in pieces, in small groups, at night. Not to kill, to scare them. Cut off their belts, steal their horses, steal their food, wolf tactics. Yuna bared her teeth, not maliciously, with anticipation. That was her specialty. That was hers. They spent 3 days devising the plan. Do Hwan didn't give orders. He listened. He made suggestions. He coordinated. Mora knew strategy. Ryong knew combat. Yuna knew the Soa, knew people. Emily knew the church. He knew each of them. He knew that Yuna got tired by the 4th hour of the watch and needed to be relieved. That Ryong limped on her right leg after a long run and shouldn't be assigned to long sorties. That Soa couldn't stand the sight of blood and needed to be kept at headquarters rather than in the field. Little things. Dozens of little things. Things that add up to the difference between the living and the dead. He did one more else. He wrote a letter to Baron Wallace, not a request, a warning. That Calvin was passing through his lands without permission. That this was a violation of the Baron's rights, that if the Baron remained silent, the church would consider his lands its own. Forever. Soa read the letter. She raised an eyebrow. She said he was a quick learner. Do Hwan replied that he had a good teacher. Soa looked at him. She didn't smile, but her tail twitched. Chol took the letter away. He returned, a week later, with a reply. The Baron was furious, not at Do Hwan, at Calvin, the church passing through his lands, without asking. It was an insult. The Baron would not go to war over the valley, but he would close the pass, his own pass, through his own lands, and let Calvin try to get through. Calvin's army had lost its main route. Two remained, both through the mountains, both long, both narrow. While the army was gathering, the valley was preparing. Yuna led 20 she-wolves into the mountains. They set traps, false trails, smoke signals, a warning system covering 3 days' journey. Ryong trained combat units every day, rigorously, without mercy. But, according to the schedule Do Hwan had drawn up, with rest, with food, with treatment for injuries, Tara wasn't forging shovels, she was forging spearheads, shields, breastplates, the first armor in the valley's history. Rough, heavy, but sturdy. Do Hwan walked among them, checking, adjusting, making sure each one ate, each one slept, each one was ready, not for battle, to return alive. Emily came to him at night. A week before the army was scheduled to set out, she said she wanted to write to her brother. Du Hwan looked at her. He asked what she wanted to write. She replied, "The truth, just the truth, about what I saw, about the children, about the school, about Hana's flute, about the cheese, about the bread, about how the little girl with horns is learning her letters, about how the wolf cub shares an apple with the lamb, just the truth." Do Hwan nodded. He said, "Write." She wrote all night long, 10 pages, in small handwriting. Tears dripped onto the paper, but her hand didn't tremble. In the morning, she gave him the letter. He read it, every word. Then he asked if she was sure that her brother might not listen, that things might get worse. She replied that she was sure, because if she didn't try, she'd regret it later, for the rest of her life. He sent the letter with Chol. Calvin's army set out in early summer, 1,000 swords, 3 orders, supply trains, siege engines, banners with a golden sun. Beautiful, intimidating, useless in the mountains. They ran into Baron Wallace's blocked pass. They stood there for 2 days, turned back, set off through the mountains, through the very same trails that Soa had rerouted a year ago, and which had now been rerouted once again, the first day. The column stretched out over 3 kilometers. The trail was narrow. Horses stumbled. Siege vehicles got stuck. By evening, the rearguard had fallen half a day behind. That night, Yuna's she-wolves cut the straps on 3 supply wagons. Silently, the wagons fell apart in the morning. Grain spilled down the slope. Soldiers spent 2 hours gathering it up by hand. The commander of the order cursed the mountains. The mountains were silent. Day 2. A false trail led the vanguard into a gorge, a dead end, a wall of rock. They turned back. They lost 4 hours. At night, smoke signals flared up on all the surrounding peaks. Dozens of lights, like eyes in the dark. The soldiers didn't sleep. They watched the lights. They whispered. The horses snored. They were nervous. 3 deserted before dawn. Day 3. Ryan and 10 tigresses set up an ambush at the bend. They didn't attack. They stood on the rocks, standing tall, wearing Tara's armor with spears. Silently. They just stood there. The army's vanguard saw them. It stopped. The commander formed a line. The archers raised their bows. The tigresses retreated behind the rocks. They vanished. The army stood in battle formation for 2 hours, waiting for an attack. There was no attack. They wasted another half day. The soldiers began to grumble. "Why are we here? We're fighting shadows." Day 4. Half the horses vanished during the night. Yuna. Her she-wolves hadn't stolen them. They'd simply cut the tethers. The horses had left on their own, into the mountains, to freedom. The cavalry became infantry. Knights in heavy armor walked along mountain trails, cursing everything under the sun. They abandoned the siege engines. There was no one left to haul them. Nowhere to set them up. The army was dwindling, not from casualties, from exhaustion. The 5th day, the 6th, the 7th. Something happened every night. Smoke, sounds, shadows, missing food, cut off straps, horses. The army reached the last pass before the valley on the 9th day instead of the 3rd. Of 1,800 remained. The rest had deserted, fallen behind, gotten lost, 800 exhausted, angry, hungry, without horses, without siege engines, without half their supplies. Calvin Roche stood on the pass and looked down at the valley, green, blooming, with smoke rising from campfires, with fields, with children by the stream. Do Hwan stood at the gate, alone, unarmed, without armor, in work clothes, with flour on his hands. Behind him stood a wall, not very high, made of stone. Behind the wall were 60 fighters. Minotaurs, tigresses, she-wolves, in Terra's armor, with spears, with bows, Mora on the right flank, Ryan on the left, Yuna on the wall, Soa in headquarters, with a map, Emily at the school, with the children, who had been taken to the caves on the western slope. Hana was with them. She was playing a flute, quietly, so the children wouldn't cry. Calvin came down from the pass, ahead of the army, on horseback, in white armor, with a golden sun on his chest. Handsome, majestic, fearsome. He stopped 100 paces from the gate. He looked at Do Hwan. Then he spoke, loudly, so that everyone could hear. He said that the shepherd of filth could surrender, to hand over the beast maiden girls, and leave alive, or he could die here, with them. The choice was his. Do Hwan stood and listened. Then he replied, quietly. But the shepherd's voice carried his words to the very last soldier in the column. He said he would not hand anyone over, not a single one, that each of them has a name, that he knows every one of them, that he knows who's allergic to clover, who needs 2 blankets, who doesn't eat after sunset, and that if Calvin wants to take them, he'll have to get past him, past the gaunt shepherd with flour on his hands. Calvin looked at him, then he raised his hand, the signal to attack, and at that moment, a rider emerged from behind Calvin, on an exhausted horse, covered in dust, a messenger. He rode up to Calvin and held out a scroll. Calvin unrolled it and read it. His face changed. It turned pale. He read it again. Then he looked at Do Hwan, then at the valley, then at the scroll. He had read Emily's letter and something else. Something from Brother Tom, the preacher, the very same one, the one who left with manure on his boots. Tom's brother had written a detailed report, not to Calvin, to the patriarch of the church. The head, higher than Calvin. The report said there was no corruption, that the beast girls weren't demons, that the valley was thriving, that the shepherd was healing, feeding, teaching, and that if the church destroyed the valley, it would destroy the only proof that the world could be a better place. The patriarch read it and sent a messenger with an order to halt the campaign immediately. Calvin sat on his horse with the order in his hand. The army behind him, the valley before him, he could have disobeyed, could have attacked. He had the power. He had the army. But in his other hand was Emily's letter, 10 pages, in small handwriting, about a girl learning her letters, about a wolf cub with an apple, about cheese, about a flute, about warm milk with honey. And somewhere between the lines was a name, the name of the girl he loved, who had died in his arms, whom he hadn't saved, because he didn't know it was just an ordinary illness, that it could have been cured with goat's milk and rest. He lowered his hand, the signal to retreat. The army withdrew, slowly, wearily, like a wounded beast. Do Hwan stood at the gate and watched as 800 men turned their backs. Some looked back at the valley, at the green fields, at the smoke from the campfires, with an expression that wasn't hatred. It was surprise. They had come to kill demons. But what they saw was a farm. That would stay with them. Every soldier would return to his village and tell the story, what he had seen, that he hadn't seen any demons, that they saw turnips and cheese and children, and every story is a crack in the wall that the church had been building for 300 years. Calvin did not leave with the army. He stayed alone, without armor, without weapons, in plain clothes. He stood at the pass and waited. Do Hwan came out to meet him. They sat on rocks facing each other. 2 men, one a skinny shepherd, the other a former chief inquisitor. Calvin spoke first. His voice was broken, quiet. He asked if it was true about the illness, about his beloved, that beast girl, who had died in his arms 20 years ago. Was it true that it wasn't a curse, not a taint, just an ordinary illness? Do Hwan nodded. He knew from Emily's letter. He knew from Mora's stories. He described the symptoms: fever, cough, weight loss, coughing up blood, night sweats. Calvin listened, his face ashen. Each symptom felt like a blow. Do Hwan said it was a lung disease, that in his world it could be treated. It would take a long time. It would be difficult, but it could be treated. Rest, clean air, good food, goat's milk, herbs, time. She could have lived if only someone had known. If only someone hadn't decided it was a curse but had simply taken a look, simply asked where it hurt. Calvin was silent for a long time. Then he covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. He was crying. Silently, the Supreme Inquisitor, handsome, eloquent, the man who burned villages, who ordered the purge, who sent 1,000 swords. He sat on a rock and cried like a child, because 20 years ago he could have saved them. And he didn't, and instead of understanding, he broke. And from his brokenness, hatred grew. Hatred that consumed thousands of lives. Do Hwan sat beside him. He didn't comfort him. He didn't condemn him. He just sat there. Just as he'd sat beside Yuna when she couldn't sleep. Just as he'd sat beside Ryong when she couldn't cry. Just as he'd sat beside each of them. Just there. Because sometimes that's all it takes. When Calvin looked up, his face was different. Not angry, not proud, empty, scorched. He asked what to do now. Do Hwan replied that it was his choice. Calvin shook his head. He said he had no choice, that he was a monster, that everything he'd done couldn't be undone. Do Hwan was silent for a moment. Then he said, "No, it can't be done. You can't bring the dead back. You can't erase the scars. You can't undo the pain, but you can stop causing new pain. You can get up and go the other way. This isn't atonement. It's just the next step." Calvin looked at him. Then he asked if they would accept him, those he had wanted to destroy. Do Hwan shook his head. No, they wouldn't. Not right away. Maybe never. But that's no reason not to try. Calvin removed the Inquisitor's symbol from his neck, a golden sun on a chain, and placed it on a rock. He stood up and walked down toward the valley. Do Hwan walked beside him. Mora stood at the gate. She looked at Calvin, the man who had given the order, who had sent Tarion, who had imposed the brand, through an intermediary. But the order was his. She stood there, 2 meters away. Black horns, golden eyes, filled with something that was neither hatred nor forgiveness. Something in between. Calvin stopped in front of her. He opened his mouth. He wanted to say something. She raised her hand. He fell silent. She said she wouldn't forgive him. Maybe never. But if he wanted to dig the ground, he could dig. The shovels were by the gate. Calvin nodded. He picked up a shovel. He went out to the field. Emily saw her brother from the school window. She dropped her chalk. She ran out. He was standing in the field with a shovel in the mud, without the golden sun, without white armor, without an army, just a simple man with a shovel. She walked over. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then she hugged him. He dropped the shovel. He hugged her. They stood like that for a long time. The children from school peered out the window. Mi asked Hana who it was. Hana replied that it was a man who had come to dig. Do Hwan stood to the side, watching. Mora stood nearby, silently. He didn't turn around. He knew she was there. He could feel her, a warm spot, the biggest one, the brightest one. She said he was crazy, that he'd let an enemy into the house, that it might be a trap, that Calvin might be lying. Do Hwan nodded. Maybe. But he'd seen his eyes. He'd seen him cry, and either Calvin was the best actor in the world or he'd truly broken down. And Do Hwan bet on the latter. Mora shook her head. She said he'd staked the valley's fate on the tears of a single person. Do Hwan turned to her, looked her in the eyes. He said he'd staked the valley's fate on the tears of a single cow on that first night, when he stitched up her wound, and he hadn't regretted it once since then. Mora froze. Her horns trembled. She turned away. She left. But the next morning, a second mug of milk stood next to his. For Calvin, she had set it out. News that the crusade had been called off spread across the continent within a month. The three kingdoms sent envoys, not armies, envoys, with letters, with proposals, with questions. They wanted to know what kind of valley it was, what kind of pashtuk, what kind of cheese, because the barons who traded with the valley through Chaol were getting rich, because their lands near the valley were yielding crops, because the peasants in the neighboring villages saw the beast-maiden girls plowing the fields and heard the children singing, and they stopped being afraid, slowly, one by one, but they stopped. Do Hwan received the envoys, in work clothes, with flour on his hands. He seated them at the table. He fed them cheese, bread, stewed turnips, goat butter. He let them taste honey from the mountain hives that Hannah had found last summer. The envoys ate. They were silent. Then one of them said the cheese was excellent. Another asked if he could buy some. A third inquired about the recipe. Du Hwan smiled and began to trade. Not as a conqueror, as a farmer. Cheese for grain, iron for cloth, honey for medicine. Simple things, honest things. Soa sat nearby and took notes in beautiful handwriting. The valley's first trade agreement with the three kingdoms. On birch bark, with charcoal, it went into effect that very day. Taurian returned quietly, at night, through the western pass, alone. The runes on his horns had burned out. All of them. He walked and fell, walked and fell. The sentries found him by the wall, unconscious, his body ravaged. As the runes burned out, they destroyed everything around them. Like a fire that dies out but takes the house with it. Du Hwan worked on him for 3 days. He didn't sleep. Mavra sat beside him. She held her brother's hand, a huge, hot hand, marked with black traces from the runes. Du Hwan did everything he could. Herbs, compresses, diagnostics. He couldn't heal what the runes had burned away. He couldn't restore what had been destroyed, but he could sustain what remained. And there wasn't much left. But it was enough. Tarion opened his eyes on the fourth morning, red, cloudy, but alive. He saw his sister. He saw the shepherd. He closed his eyes, and he cried quietly, like a child, huge, 2 meters tall, broken, like a child who had finally been found. The third year, spring, the valley was in bloom. For the first time in 300 years, horned irises had bloomed, small, purple, with petals resembling curved horns. They grew only where the beast girls felt safe. They hadn't grown for 300 years, and now Hannah found the first one. By the stream, small, timid, she called out to Do Hwan. He crouched down, looked, touched a petal. Soft, warm, alive. Like everything in this valley. Like everything in this valley, he smiled. Hannah smiled beside him. Mi ran over. She crouched down. She touched it. She laughed. Ryong stood 3 steps away, holding the foundling in her arms, whom she had long since stopped calling Maltz and now called Tan, who was already over a year old, who grabbed her finger and wouldn't let go. Ryong looked at the flower, at the children, at the shepherd. Her face was stony, but her eyes were wet, as always when she thought no one was watching. By summer, the horned irises covered the entire southern slope, a sea of purple. Hwan stood at the pass and looked down. 3 villages had become 5. Fields covered 3 slopes. The blacksmith shop had grown into a workshop. The infirmary had become a 10-bed hospital. The school had 2 classrooms. Mora stood on the cliff every evening. But now she wasn't alone. Tarion was beside her, huge, quiet, broken, but alive. He didn't say much. He couldn't. The runes had burned something in his mind. Words came slowly, with difficulty, but he stood beside his sister and looked out over the valley, and that was enough. Mora was no longer alone. 300 years alone, and now no longer alone. A delegation from the 3 kingdoms arrived in the middle of summer, an official one, with seals, with parchments, with an escort. Not an army, an honor guard. 20 knights, in ceremonial armor, unarmed, with flags. They rode along the road the Beast Maiden girls had built over the past year, a real road, made of stone, smooth, with bridges over streams. The knights looked around. At the fields, at the grazing goats, at the minotaurs working in the smithy, at the she-wolves patrolling the mountain passes, at the children running along the road, at the irises, at all of it, And in their eyes was what Do Hwan had seen in the eyes of the slave traders 3 years ago, but the opposite. Not greed, surprise, respect, perhaps even envy. The main square of the new city, yes, a city, not a village, not a settlement, a fortress city at the bottom of the valley, with stone houses, with a central square, with a fountain that Tara had built from mountain stone and copper pipes. Water shot upward and fell into a stone basin. Children threw pebbles into it and made wishes. Everyone had gathered in the square. 173 residents, plus 23 from the Ryan clan, plus the refugees who came every month, a total of just over 200, horned, tailed, winged, striped, and humans. Emily, Calvin, Chul, who had come especially for this. 3 more families from neighboring villages who had moved to the valley, because there was a harvest here, there was water here, there was peace here, humans among the beast girls, without fear, without hatred, just side by side. The ambassadors read the treaty aloud. Long, formal. Soa had written it together with Emily. 3 weeks, every word carefully crafted. The essence is simple. The valley is recognized as an autonomous principality. Trade is free. Borders are inviolable. The beast girls are granted the right to land, to craftsmanship, to education, to life. The Great Purge has not been cancelled. Not yet. But the first crack has appeared. Wide, deep, irreversible. Because the 3 kingdoms have signed a document stating in black and white that beast girls are not demons. They are citizens, with rights, with names, with lives. Calvin Roche arrived on foot, without a horse, without an entourage, without the golden sun, in a simple monk's robe, with Sister Emily by his side. He walked across the square, past the Minotaurs, who glared at him with hatred, past the she-wolves, who bared their teeth, past the tigresses, who clenched their fists. He walked on, never looking away, never hiding his gaze, never lowering his eyes. He reached Mora. He stood before her. She looked down on him from above. 2 meters tall, black horns, golden eyes. 3 years ago, he had sent an army to destroy her and everyone she loved. Now he stood before her in a cassock, with a shovel on his back. That very same one, the one he'd taken at the gate, the one he'd used to dig the ground for 7 months. Not by order, by choice. He dropped to one knee, said he was asking for forgiveness, not expecting it. Just asking. He knew he didn't deserve it, but he asked, because it was the only thing left. Silence. The square was silent. 200 pairs of eyes. Mora stood there. She looked at him for a long time. Then she took a step forward. She placed her hand on his shoulder. A heavy hand. Large. She didn't strike him. She didn't push him away. She simply placed it there. Calvin closed his eyes. Mora said nothing. She didn't need to. That hand on his shoulder said it all. Not forgiveness. Not hatred. A beginning. A possibility. A chance. Ryan stood next to Tan, holding him in her arms. The little boy turned his head from side to side. He reached out his hands toward the shining armor of the envoys. Ryan caught his little hand. She pressed it close to her. Yuna stood on the wall, high above, a view of the entire square. Out of habit, but the dagger under her pillow had been gone for half a year now. Lavender, crumpled, worn, but lavender. Soa stood next to the envoys, with birch bark notes, with beautiful handwriting, with a genuine smile, subtle, crooked, unprofessional, genuine. Hana was playing the flute by the fountain, me beside her, 2 flutes, 2 voices. The melody rose above the square and drifted off into the mountains. Tarion stood behind his sister, huge, quiet, with faded runes, with eyes in which something was slowly kindling, not fire, not rage, warmth, the very same warmth that Do Hwan had sent him through touch, the warmth that remained and grew. Do Hwan was in the kitchen. He was baking bread. For the banquet, because after the signing, everyone would be eating, and he wanted the food to be just right. A flatbread with honey for more, meat for you, an omelet for Soa, milk for Hain, a pepper soup for Ryong, braised turnips for Emily, plain bread with salt for Calvin. Because Calvin didn't deserve honey, not yet. But bread with salt is a start. Broth for Tarion, thick, rich, with bones, to help his body recover. Cheese for Chol, the best piece, because without Chol there would be nothing. porridge with honey and berries for little me, because she's 7 and the world should be sweet. He kneaded the dough and thought about the calf, the one he'd shielded with his own body at the farm in Chola, in another life, in another world, about how the calf was Mavra, how she was coming to meet him across the worlds, how he hadn't ended up here by accident, how he'd come home to the one he'd already saved once without even knowing it. He didn't know how he knew this. The system didn't say anything. No one said anything. He just knew, the way you know things that have always been. The way you know that water is wet, that fire is hot, that a cow with moist eyes and a woman with black horns are one and the same being. His Nuna, his first, the one he sewed up with a rusty sickle and oozed out of his shoe as warm, bubbly dough, to whom he sets out milk and honey every morning, who has never once asked. He has never once forgotten. The dough was ready. He shaped the bread, put it in the oven, waited. He took it out, hot, fragrant, real wheat bread, made from grain that Chul had brought, that had grown on land plowed by minotaurs, that had been watered from the canal he'd dug with Yuna, in the field the council had given him after he'd delivered the wolf's litter, in the valley the cow with teary eyes on the 3rd night of his new life. Everything is connected. Everything comes from a single grain, from a single touch, from a single decision, to take off your jacket and cover a stranger's back. He stepped out onto the balcony, overlooking the square. Below, a hum of voices, horned, tailed, winged, human, together. At one table, irises bloomed along the walls. Heaven was bustling. Children ran between the adults' legs. Me tugged at Ryan's sleeve and pointed to a butterfly. Ryan crouched down. She looked. Tan, in her arms, reached for the butterfly. Yuna sprawled on her back against the wall. Her legs dangled. Her ears stuck out, relaxed, for the first time in 3 years. Soa said something to the servant. He laughed. She smiled. Truly. Her tail swayed. Hana and me were playing 2 little flutes. The melody was like a warm breeze. Mavra stood by the fountain. Her hand was still on Calvin's shoulder, or perhaps she'd already taken it away. He didn't see, but she stood calmly for the first time in 300 years. Tarion was beside her, huge, quiet, alive. Emily was holding her brother's hand. With her other hand, she was brushing flour off his robe. Because he'd been kneading dough all day, helping Do Hwan, silently, clumsily, but helping. Do Hwan was standing on the balcony, covered in flour, hands in dough, his face tired, kind, round, with calluses, with bruises, with cracks on his fingers, hands that had sewn up wounds with a rusty sickle, that had dug wells, that had kneaded bread, that had stroked between the horns, that had held the dying, hands that delivered newborns, hands that never once struck a blow. He looked out at his valley, at all his people, at each and every one. He remembered every name, every allergy, every fear, every favorite food. He remembered that Mora's back aches in the rain, that Yuna needs 2 blankets, that Hana won't eat if it's noisy nearby, that Ryan loves pepper because he misses the South, that Soa licks her fingers after eating cheese when she thinks no one is watching, that Emily writes everything down in a notebook with the air of a scientist, that Me can't fall asleep without her, that Tarion is afraid of the dark and Mavra leaves him a candle every night, that Calvin digs crookedly but persistently, that Chul brings extra flour and pretends it's part of the contract. 200 names, 200 lives, 200 warm spots on the edge of his consciousness, his flock, his family, his home. He didn't save the people. The people is too broad a term. He knew Mavra. He knew Yuna. He knew Hana. He knew Ryan. He knew Soa. He knew Emily. He knew me, one by one. And he saved each one by one. Not with a sword, not with magic, with a shovel, a sickle, milk, bread, a name, a touch, silence at the right moment, a word at the right second, a turnip in his pocket. He looked out at the square, at the warrior women, at the queens, at the children, at the inquisitor with the shovel, at the old miller with the cheese, at everyone. And he said quietly, in that voice, the voice of the shepherd, which everyone hears, no matter the distance, just as he had once spoken to the calf trapped under a concrete block in the province of Chola. He said that they had managed it, all of them together, and that it was time to eat while the food was still hot. And the entire square obediently went to eat. Mora raised her head. She looked at the balcony, at the gaunt shepherd in distress, who, 3 years ago, had taken off his only jacket and draped it over her back, who had stitched up her wound with a rusty sickle, who sets out milk and honey every morning, who has never once forgotten. She looked at him and said quietly, so that only he could hear. She said that her husband remembers that they are human. He heard her and smiled, broadly, silly, like a shepherd, like a man who knows his cow is healthy, that his herd is fed, that his farm is standing, that the world isn't perfect, but it's warm, and that's enough. That's always enough.